She married the wrong man on a train platform in 1881, and by the time she realized her mistake, half the town had already witnessed their vows. Eleanor Price had been expecting a modest clerk named William Hartford. Instead, she got Colt Avery, a rugged cowboy with secrets darker than the Dakota night. When the real groom arrived with a lawman at his side, everything she thought she knew shattered. This is their story. Watch until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The Dakota wind carried the scent of rain and rust as Eleanor Price stood on the platform of Dakota Junction, her gloved fingers trembling around a piece of paper that had become her entire future. The letter was worn soft from being read 100 times, folded and unfolded until the creases threatened to tear through the carefully penned words. Dear Miss Price, I accept your proposal of correspondence and matrimony. I shall arrive on the 3:47 train, October 14th, respectfully, William Hartford. October 14th, 1881. Today. Eleanor's heart hammered against her corset stays as she watched the horizon, where a thin line of black smoke began to rise above the amber prairie grass. The train was coming. Her future was coming, and she wasn't sure if she was more terrified or relieved. Behind her, the small wooden station house offered little shelter from the biting autumn wind. Dakota Junction wasn't much of a town, a collection of weather-beaten buildings clustered around the railway like chicks around a hen, hoping the trains would bring prosperity or at least survival. The general store, the saloon, the church with its crooked steeple, the hotel that smelled of tobacco and desperation. This was home, whether Eleanor liked it or not. She'd lived here for 3 years, ever since her father's death had left her with a dress shop, a mountain of debt, and a reputation as the spinster seamstress who made beautiful wedding gowns for other women but would never wear one herself. At 26, she was too old for romance, too poor for security, and too proud to beg. The mail-order advertisement had seemed like the only answer, a practical solution to an impossible problem. Now, as the train's whistle cut through the October air like a cry, Eleanor wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. "He'll be a good man," she whispered to herself, the words nearly lost in the wind. "He'll be kind. He'll be—" The train roared into the station with a screech of brakes and a cloud of steam that engulfed the platform in a temporary fog. Eleanor stepped back, her heart in her throat, as the great iron beast shuddered to a stop. For a moment, everything was white and hissing and impossible to see. Then the steam began to clear. The first person to step off the train was a woman in a purple dress, dragging a reluctant child. Then an elderly gentleman with a cane. Then a salesman with a case of rattling bottles. Eleanor craned her neck, searching for a man who fit William Hartford's description. Average height, brown hair, spectacles, a clerk's soft hands, and scholar's stoop. Instead, she saw him. He was tall, over 6 feet easily, with shoulders broad enough to fill the train car doorway. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw, darkened with several days of stubble. He wore dusty leather chaps over worn denim, a blue shirt that had seen better days, and a gun belt that sat low on his hips in a way that suggested he knew how to use it. When he stepped onto the platform, his boots hit the wood with a solid, confident thud. This was not William Hartford. But when the man's eyes, startlingly blue even in the fading afternoon light, scanned the platform and landed on her, something in Eleanor's chest twisted. He had the look of a man who'd seen too much and trusted too little, but when their gazes met, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition, though they'd never met. He walked toward her, and Eleanor found herself unable to move. "You must be Eleanor," he said, and his voice was like whiskey and smoke, rough and warm, all at once. Eleanor's mouth went dry. I'm sorry, I think there's been a— Eleanor Price?" He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, and Eleanor's heart sank as she recognized the elegant script, her own handwriting, the letter she'd sent to William Hartford, care of the Deadwood post office. How did this man have her letter? "Yes, but—" Eleanor started, but before she could finish, a voice called out from behind her, "There she is, the blushing bride!" Eleanor turned to see Reverend Thomas Marsh hurrying across the platform, his black coat flapping in the wind like crow's wings. Behind him came half the town's busybodies, Mrs. Calloway from the boarding house, Mr. Peterson from the general store, young Sally Henderson, who worked at the hotel and couldn't keep a secret if her life depended on it. "Oh no," Eleanor breathed. "Miss Price!" The Reverend beamed, his round face flushed with excitement. "And this must be the fortunate gentleman, Mr. Hartford, I presume." "Actually, I'm—" the cowboy began, but Reverend Marsh was already pumping his hand enthusiastically. "Welcome to Dakota Junction. We're so delighted you've come. Miss Price has been quite the topic of conversation these past weeks, I must say. The whole town is thrilled to see her finally settling down. Such a deserving young woman." "Reverend, there's been a mistake," Eleanor tried, but her voice was swallowed by the growing crowd. "No mistake at all, my dear." Mrs. Calloway pushed forward, her feathered hat bobbing. "We've been preparing for this wedding for days. The church is ready, the flowers are arranged, and I've baked 3 pies." Eleanor felt the situation spiraling out of her control like a runaway horse. "But this isn't— Shall we proceed to the church?" Reverend Marsh clapped his hands together. "No sense in delaying. I'm sure you're both eager to begin your new life together." The cowboy, whoever he was, looked at Eleanor with an expression that somehow managed to be both amused and alarmed. "Ma'am, I think we should—" "Oh, how sweet! He's tongue-tied," Sally Henderson giggled, nudging her friend. "Isn't that romantic?" Eleanor's face burned. This was a nightmare, a complete and utter disaster. She opened her mouth to protest again, to explain that this man was a stranger, that she'd never seen him before in her life, that there had obviously been some terrible mix-up with the letters. But then she saw it. The way Mrs. Calloway was looking at her with such genuine happiness, the first time in 3 years anyone in this town had looked at her with anything other than pity. The way Mr. Peterson was actually smiling when usually he only frowned at her unpaid accounts. The way even stern old Reverend Marsh seemed almost joyful. For the first time since her father's death, she wasn't the poor, pathetic Eleanor Price, drowning in debt and loneliness. She was a bride. She was wanted. She was worth celebrating. "Eleanor?" The cowboy's voice was low, meant only for her ears. "You want me to tell them the truth?" She looked up at him, this stranger with kind eyes and a gun on his hip, and made a choice that would change everything. "Not yet," she whispered. His eyebrows rose, but before either of them could say another word, the crowd swept them up like a river current, carrying them toward the little white church at the end of Main Street. The church was small and drafty, with wooden pews that creaked and a pulpit that leaned slightly to the left. Someone had tied white ribbons to the ends of each pew, and a jar of wildflowers sat on the altar, their petals already wilting in the dry air. It should have been depressing, this hastily arranged ceremony in a half-empty church. Instead, it felt like a dream. Eleanor stood at the altar, acutely aware of the tall stranger beside her. Up close, she could see the details she'd missed on the platform. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands, the way his shirt collar was frayed at the edges. He smelled like leather and horse and wide-open spaces, completely different from the lavender soap and furniture polish scent she'd expected from a clerk. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Marsh began, his voice echoing in the small space, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Eleanor's stomach twisted. This was insane. She should stop it right now, confess the mistake, apologize to everyone, and wait for the real William Hartford to arrive. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped behind the unfamiliar feeling of being the center of attention for something good instead of something pitiful. "Do you, Colt Avery, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Eleanor's head snapped toward the cowboy. Colt Avery. Not William Hartford. She'd been so caught up in the chaos that she hadn't even asked his name. Colt, if that was really his name, looked down at her. In his eyes, she saw a question, a choice. He could end this right now with a single word. They both could. "I do," he said. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Eleanor's breath caught. "And do you, Eleanor Price, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Around them, the small congregation leaned forward, waiting. Mrs. Calloway dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Mr. Peterson nodded encouragingly. Even Sally Henderson had stopped giggling and was watching with genuine anticipation. Eleanor thought of her empty house, her failing business, the letters from creditors she couldn't bear to open. She thought of the long, lonely nights and the longer, lonelier days. She thought of William Hartford, a man she'd never met, who might be kind or might be cruel, who might save her or might make everything worse. Then she looked at Colt Avery, this stranger who'd stepped off a train and into her life by accident, who had kind eyes despite the gun on his hip, who could have walked away but hadn't. "I do," she whispered. Reverend Marsh beamed. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Dakota, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Eleanor's eyes widened. She hadn't thought this far ahead. Colt looked equally surprised, but before either of them could react, Mrs. Calloway called out, "Don't be shy now." Colt cleared his throat. "Ma'am, Eleanor, we don't have to." But Eleanor, driven by some reckless impulse she didn't fully understand, rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was meant to be quick, perfunctory, just enough to satisfy the crowd. But the moment their lips met, something electric passed between them. Colt's hand came up to steady her, warm and strong against her back, and for a heartbeat, maybe two, the world fell away. There was no church, no crowd, no mistake. Just the two of them, suspended in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. When they broke apart, Eleanor's cheeks were flaming and Colt looked slightly dazed. The congregation erupted in applause. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Avery," Reverend Marsh announced, and the name hit Eleanor like a bucket of cold water. Mrs. Avery. She was Mrs. Colt Avery now, married to a man whose last name she'd learned 5 minutes ago, whose first name she'd learned 30 seconds before that. What had she done? The reception, if it could be called that, took place in the churchyard. Mrs. Calloway had indeed made 3 pies, apple, cherry, and something that might have been peach, but could have also been apricot. Mr. Peterson contributed a jug of cider that was probably harder than he was willing to admit in front of the Reverend. People Eleanor barely knew came up to shake her hand, to congratulate her, to tell her how happy they were for her. Through it all, Colt stayed close to her side, playing the role of dutiful husband with an ease that was almost concerning. He shook hands with the men, tipped his hat to the ladies, and accepted their congratulations with a crooked smile that made Eleanor's stomach do strange flips. "He's quite the catch," Mrs. Calloway whispered, elbowing Eleanor conspiratorially. "So handsome! And those shoulders! You're a lucky woman, dear." Eleanor managed a weak smile, watching as Colt chatted with Mr. Peterson about horses. He seemed comfortable, relaxed even, as if accidentally marrying a stranger was something he did every Tuesday. "Mrs. Avery?" Eleanor turned to find Sally Henderson holding out a piece of cherry pie on a chipped china plate. "I just wanted to say congratulations. You deserve to be happy." The sincerity in the young woman's voice made Eleanor's throat tighten. "Thank you, Sally. And don't you worry about those old biddies who said you'd never find a husband. They're just jealous." Sally grinned. "Your man is 10 times finer than any of theirs." Before Eleanor could respond, Colt appeared at her elbow. "Mind if I steal my wife for a moment?" My wife. The words should have sounded absurd. Instead, they sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. Sally giggled and hurried off, and Colt gently guided Eleanor away from the crowd, toward the side of the church where they could talk without being overheard. "All right," he said quietly, his blue eyes serious. "I think we need to talk about what just happened." "I know." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite her wool dress. "I'm sorry. I should have stopped it. I don't know what came over me." "You don't need to apologize." Colt leaned against the church wall, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "But we do need to figure out what we're going to do." "We could tell them the truth," Eleanor said, though even as she spoke, she knew it was too late for that. They'd witnessed vows. The marriage was legal, whether it was based on a mistake or not. "We could," Colt agreed, "but I'm guessing you had a reason for not stopping it when you had the chance." Eleanor looked away, ashamed. "I'm not a dishonest person, Mr. Avery. I want you to know that. But when everyone was looking at me like I mattered, I couldn't." She trailed off, unable to finish. "You needed this," Colt said, and there was no judgment in his voice. "I understand." "Do you?" Eleanor looked up at him sharply. "Because I don't. I don't understand why you went along with it. You don't know me. You owe me nothing. Why didn't you just walk away?" Colt was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Let's just say I know what it's like to need an escape." Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, Reverend Marsh called out, "There you are! Come now, don't be hiding away when there are guests to attend to." Colt straightened, offering Eleanor his arm with a rueful smile. "Shall we, Mrs. Avery?" Eleanor hesitated, then took his arm. His muscles were solid beneath the worn cotton of his shirt, and she was acutely aware of his warmth, his presence, the strange intimacy of touching a man she barely knew. "Just for tonight," she whispered as they walked back toward the crowd. "We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." "Just for tonight," Colt agreed, but they both knew it was already more complicated than that. The sun was setting by the time the last of the well-wishers finally dispersed, painting the Dakota sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the mess Eleanor had created. She stood outside her small house, a modest wooden structure behind her dress shop, with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged on one side, and wondered how she was going to explain to Colt Avery that he couldn't actually stay here. "This is home?" Colt asked, hitching his saddlebags higher on his shoulder. He'd retrieved them from the train station along with a horse, a gorgeous bay gelding that was currently tied to Eleanor's porch rail, looking far too fine for the shabby surroundings. "It's not much," Eleanor said defensively. "But it's mine. Well, mostly. There's a mortgage and some other debts, but—" She stopped, realizing she was babbling. "Anyway, you can't stay here." Colt raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, we just got married. People are going to expect me to stay with my wife." "We're not really married," Eleanor hissed, looking around to make sure no one was listening. The street was empty, most people having retreated indoors for supper, but she couldn't be too careful. "This whole thing is a mistake, a misunderstanding. You know that." The Reverend seemed to think it was pretty official. Colt's lips quirked in what might have been amusement. "And legally speaking, we said vows in front of witnesses. I'm pretty sure that counts." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "This isn't funny, Mr. Avery." "Colt," he corrected, "and I'm not laughing. I'm just trying to figure out what you want me to do. I can sleep in the stable if you prefer, but come morning, folks are going to talk if your husband spent your wedding night with the horses." He was right, and Eleanor hated it. She pressed her fingers to her temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. "Fine. You can sleep on the settee, but just for tonight. Tomorrow, we're going to Reverend Marsh and explaining the whole thing. If that's what you want." Something in his tone made Eleanor look up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" Colt shrugged. "Just seems like you might want to think it through before you go confessing. You said yourself you've got debts. A husband might help with that, even a fake one." "I don't need charity," Eleanor said stiffly. "Didn't say you did, but I'm not offering charity." Colt met her eyes steadily. "I came to Dakota Junction to buy a horse. That's done. I got a fine animal at a fair price, but my return train doesn't leave until next week. I need a place to stay, and you need people to think you're happily married. Seems like we could help each other out." Eleanor's heart beat faster. "You're suggesting we— What, pretend to be married for a week? Why not? I'll sleep on your settee, you do whatever it is you do, and when my train leaves, you can tell everyone I had business elsewhere. By then, the excitement will have died down, and you can go back to your life. With one difference. You'll have a husband who people believe exists. That might buy you some time with those creditors." It was insane. Completely and utterly insane. And yet, Eleanor thought of Mr. Peterson's smile at the reception, the first time he'd looked at her without frowning at her account balance. She thought of Mrs. Calloway's genuine happiness, so different from the pitying glances Eleanor usually received. She thought of how it had felt, just for a few hours, to be someone other than the struggling spinster seamstress. "1 week," she heard herself say, "and you sleep on the settee." Colt grinned. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor unlocked the door and stepped into her small house, very aware of Colt following behind her. The front room served as both parlor and workspace, with a worn settee near the fireplace and a sewing table by the window, covered in scraps of fabric and half-finished garments. Beyond that was a tiny kitchen, and upstairs a single bedroom barely large enough for a bed and washstand. It's not much, Eleanor said again, lighting the oil lamp on the mantel. Warm light filled the room, making the shabby furniture look almost cozy. It's nice, Colt said, and he sounded sincere. He set his saddlebags down by the door and looked around with genuine interest. You make these? He was looking at the dresses hanging from hooks on the wall, a blue day dress with intricate pleating, a green silk evening gown with elaborate beadwork, a simple white wedding dress with lace sleeves. Yes, Eleanor said. I'm a seamstress. Or I was. Business has been slow. These are beautiful. Colt touched the white dress carefully, as if afraid he might damage it with his rough hands. You're talented. The compliment made Eleanor's chest ache with an emotion she couldn't name. Thank you. They stood there in awkward silence for a moment, the reality of the situation settling over them like dust. I should make some supper, Eleanor finally said. Are you hungry? Starving, Colt admitted. But you don't have to. I have to eat anyway, Eleanor interrupted. Might as well make enough for two. In the kitchen, Eleanor busied herself with preparing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and the leftover stew she'd made the day before. It wasn't much, but it was warm and filling. As she worked, she was acutely aware of Colt's presence in the other room, the sound of him moving around, settling in. This was her house, her space, and she'd never shared it with anyone since her father died. Having a man here, especially a man she didn't know, should have felt invasive, threatening even. Instead, it felt almost comfortable. When she carried the food into the front room, she found Colt had started a fire in the hearth. The flames crackled cheerfully, driving away the October chill. Hope you don't mind, he said. Seemed cold. No, that's... Thank you. Eleanor set the plates on the small table near the window. It's usually just me, so I don't always bother with a fire. They ate in silence at first, the only sounds the clink of utensils and the pop of burning wood. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Colt, trying to figure him out. He ate with the efficiency of someone who'd spent time on the trail, but his manners were good, better than she'd expected from a cowboy. Can I ask you something? Eleanor said finally. Colt looked up. Shoot. Why did you have my letter, the one addressed to William Hartford? Colt set down his fork, his expression growing serious. Found it at the Deadwood post office. I was picking up mail for my boss. I work at a ranch about 50 miles north of here. The postmaster was sorting through letters, and he asked if I was heading to Dakota Junction. When I said I was, he asked if I'd deliver a letter to Miss Eleanor Price. But it was addressed to William Hartford. The envelope was, Colt agreed. But when I got to the station, I saw a woman standing alone, looking nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. You matched the description I'd overheard the postmaster reading from another letter. Brown hair, average height, wearing a gray dress. I figured you were Eleanor Price, and I was going to hand you the letter and be on my way. But then the Reverend assumed you were William. And you didn't correct him. Colt's blue eyes held hers. Why not? Eleanor looked away, shame burning in her chest. I told you. Everyone was so happy, and I wanted to feel that. Just for a moment. There's more to it than that. Colt's voice was gentle but firm. You're in some kind of trouble, aren't you? Eleanor's first instinct was to deny it, to maintain the fiction that everything was fine. But what was the point? Colt had already seen her shabby house, her meager supper, the evidence of her struggling business. And if they were going to maintain this charade for a week, he deserved to know the truth. My father owned a general store, she said quietly. When he died 3 years ago, I thought I'd inherit it, but it turned out he had debts I didn't know about. The bank took the store, and I was left with nothing but a small inheritance, barely enough to buy this house and set up my dress shop. And the shop isn't doing well? It was at first, but Dakota Junction is small, and there are only so many women who need new dresses. I've been taking in mending, alterations, anything I can get, but it's not enough. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. I have creditors who want to be paid, a mortgage I can barely afford, and the knowledge that if I fail, I'll have nothing, no home, no business, nowhere to go. So you wrote to William Hartford. I saw an advertisement in the newspaper. Men looking for wives, willing to provide security in exchange for companionship. It seemed Eleanor trailed off, unable to finish. Practical, Colt supplied. Desperate, Eleanor corrected. But I was desperate. I am desperate. Colt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on her face. And what about now? You married me instead of Hartford. How does that help? It doesn't, Eleanor admitted. That's why this whole thing is insane. I've made everything worse. Maybe not. Colt leaned back in his chair, firelight playing across his features. You said you have creditors who want to be paid. Having a husband might buy you some time. Men don't like to pressure a married woman the same way they pressure a spinster. Eleanor frowned. That's manipulation. It's survival. Colt's expression was serious. Look, Eleanor, and I'm going to call you Eleanor because we're married, even if it's by accident, you did what you had to do to stay afloat. That's nothing to be ashamed of. And if me staying here for a week helps you keep your home and your business, then I'm willing to do it. Why? Eleanor asked, the question bursting out of her. Why would you help me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. What do you get out of this? Colt looked away, his jaw tightening. For the first time since she'd met him, he seemed uncomfortable. Let's just say I know what it's like to need help and not have anyone to ask. Consider this me paying forward a kindness I once received. There was a story there, Eleanor could tell. Something painful and personal that Colt wasn't ready to share. And despite her curiosity, she found herself respecting his privacy. All right, she said softly. 1 week. We pretend to be happily married, and then you leave on your train. But there have to be rules, such as, you sleep on the settee, not in my room. We maintain separate lives as much as possible. And when the week is over, we end this cleanly. No complications, no drama. Agreed. Colt extended his hand across the table. Deal? Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand, calloused, strong, honest, and felt that same electric current she'd felt during their kiss at the altar. This was madness, but it was also the first time in 3 years she'd felt something other than despair. She took his hand. Deal. That night, Eleanor lay in her small bed upstairs, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in her house. Colt moved quietly, but she could hear him, the creak of the settee as he settled in, the rustle of his blanket, the soft sound of his breathing. She'd given him an old quilt and a spare pillow, apologizing for their worn condition. He'd thanked her with that crooked smile that made her stomach flip, and then she'd fled upstairs like a scared rabbit. Now, in the darkness of her room, Eleanor tried to make sense of the past 12 hours. This morning, she'd been a struggling seamstress waiting for a mail-order husband she'd never met. Tonight, she was Mrs. Colt Avery, married to a cowboy who'd stepped off the wrong train at the right time. It was temporary, she reminded herself. Just a week, and then Colt would leave and everything would go back to normal. Except it wouldn't, would it? She'd be Eleanor Price again, but now people would think she had a husband. They'd ask about him, expect him to visit, wonder why he never came home. She'd have to maintain the lie or admit the truth. And if she admitted the truth, the gossip would be devastating. The whole town would know she'd married a stranger by accident, that her real mail-order groom had never shown up, that her life was even more pathetic than they'd thought. Eleanor rolled over, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She'd figure it out. She had to. Because the alternative, public humiliation and financial ruin, was unthinkable. Downstairs, she heard Colt shift on the settee, and despite herself, Eleanor found the sound comforting. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't alone in this house. Even if it was temporary, even if it was based on a lie, just for tonight, she could pretend. Just for tonight, she could close her eyes and imagine what it might be like to have someone to share this burden with. Someone strong and kind with a crooked smile and blue eyes that seemed to see right through her defenses. Just for tonight, she could dream. Tomorrow, reality would return. Tomorrow, she'd have to face the consequences of her impulsive decision. Tomorrow, she'd remember all the reasons why this could never work. But tonight, in the warm darkness of her room, Eleanor let herself believe in the impossible. Downstairs, Colt Avery lay on the too-short settee and stared at the dying embers in the fireplace, his mind racing. What the hell had he gotten himself into? He'd come to Dakota Junction for a simple horse trade, planning to be in and out within a day. Instead, he was now legally married to a woman he'd met 6 hours ago, sleeping in her house, and committed to maintaining a fiction for the next week. It was insane. Completely insane. And yet, he hadn't been able to walk away. When he'd seen Eleanor on that platform, something in his chest had tightened. She'd looked so hopeful and so terrified at the same time, clutching that letter like it was a lifeline. And when the crowd had swept them up, when he'd seen how the whole town transformed her from invisible to celebrated, he'd understood. He understood what it was like to be invisible, to be nobody, to need an escape so badly you'd do something reckless. Colt shifted, trying to find a comfortable position on the settee. His feet hung over the edge and the cushions were lumpy, but he'd slept in worse places. Much worse. The house settled around him with small creaks and groans, and somewhere upstairs he could hear Eleanor moving in her room. He wondered if she was sleeping or if she was lying awake like he was, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. Tomorrow, they'd figure out the details of their arrangement. Tonight, he'd just try to get through without overthinking everything. But as Colt finally drifted off to sleep, his last conscious thought was of Eleanor's face when they'd kissed at the altar. The surprise in her eyes, the softness of her lips, the way she'd looked at him like maybe, just maybe, he was exactly what she'd been hoping for. It was dangerous, that thought, because Colt Avery had his own secrets, his own reasons for needing an escape, and the longer he stayed in Dakota Junction, the more likely those secrets would catch up with him. He should leave tomorrow, take his horse, and ride out before anyone got hurt. But even as he thought it, Colt knew he wouldn't. He'd made a deal, and Colt Avery always kept his word, even if it destroyed him. Morning came too quickly, filtering through the thin curtains and pale golden streams that did nothing to ease the knot of anxiety in Eleanor's stomach. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through every possible disaster that could result from yesterday's impulsive decision. Now, lying in bed and listening to the sounds of Colt moving around downstairs, she realized she had no idea how to navigate the day ahead. What did married people do the morning after their wedding, especially married people who were essentially strangers? Eleanor forced herself out of bed, splashing cold water on her face from the basin on her washstand. Her reflection in the small mirror looked pale and worried, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of pinching her cheeks could disguise. She dressed quickly in a simple brown work dress, braided her hair, and took a deep breath before heading downstairs. The smell of coffee hit her first, rich and unexpected. Then she saw Colt standing at her stove, somehow managing to look completely at home in her cramped kitchen, despite his size. He'd already dressed, the same worn clothes from yesterday, though his hair was damp as if he'd washed at the pump outside. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder with that crooked smile. "Hope you don't mind. I found your coffee tin and figured we could both use some." "I don't mind," Eleanor said, surprised by how much she meant it. "Thank you." She moved into the kitchen, hyper-aware of the small space and how close they had to stand to navigate around each other. Colt poured coffee into 2 mismatched cups and handed her one. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Eleanor felt that same electric current from yesterday. "Sleep well?" Colt asked. "Not particularly. You?" "That settee is about a foot too short, but I've had worse." He leaned against the counter, cradling his cup. "We should probably talk about how we're going to handle today." Eleanor nodded, grateful for his directness. "People will expect to see us together. Mrs. Calloway mentioned something yesterday about bringing by a wedding gift this morning. Then we'll be together when she arrives." Colt took a sip of coffee. "What's your usual routine?" "I work in the shop, take in orders, do fittings, mending, though honestly, I haven't had many customers lately." "Maybe that'll change now." When Eleanor looked at him questioningly, Colt shrugged. "You're not the struggling spinster anymore. You're a respectable married woman. People might feel differently about giving you their business." It was a cynical observation, but Eleanor suspected he was right. Reputation meant everything in a small town like Dakota Junction. "What about you?" she asked. "What do cowboys do when they're not buying horses?" "Well, this cowboy needs to check on his horse for one. Then I should probably make myself useful around here." Colt's eyes traveled to the sagging porch she'd noticed him studying last night. "That porch could use some work, and I noticed your roof looks like it might leak come winter." "You don't have to do that," Eleanor protested. "This is just a business arrangement." And part of the arrangement is convincing people we're really married. What kind of husband would I be if I let my wife's house fall down around her ears? Colt's tone was light, but his eyes were serious. Besides, I need something to do. Can't just sit around all week. Before Eleanor could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the house. They looked at each other, and Eleanor saw her own nervousness reflected in Colt's eyes. "Showtime," he murmured, setting down his coffee cup. Eleanor opened the door to find Mrs. Calloway on the porch, holding a covered basket and beaming like she'd just won a prize at the county fair. "Good morning, dear. I hope I'm not intruding, but I simply had to bring you a proper wedding breakfast." Mrs. Calloway bustled inside without waiting for an invitation, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Oh, how cozy! And there's your handsome husband. Good morning, Mr. Avery." "Morning, ma'am." Colt tipped an imaginary hat, his easy charm making Eleanor simultaneously grateful and nervous. "I've brought fresh biscuits, jam, and some of that honey Mr. Peterson keeps in the back of his store for special customers." Mrs. Calloway set the basket on the table, then turned to Eleanor with a knowing smile. "You look tired, dear. Didn't get much sleep, I imagine." She actually winked. Eleanor's face burned. "Mrs. Calloway, oh, don't be embarrassed. You're newlyweds. It's perfectly natural." The older woman patted Eleanor's hand. "Now, I won't keep you. I'm sure you both have things to attend to, but Eleanor, I wanted to mention I spoke with Mrs. Henderson this morning, and she's interested in having you make a new dress for her daughter Sally, for the Christmas social." Eleanor's heart leaped. Mrs. Henderson had never commissioned anything from her before, always taking her business to the seamstress in Deadwood. "Really?" "Really. She'll stop by later this week to discuss it." Mrs. Calloway lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think your marriage has changed how people see you. A woman with a husband is more respectable, more trustworthy, especially a husband as fine as yours." The word should have made Eleanor feel guilty. Instead, she felt a surge of vindication. This was exactly what she'd hoped for yesterday when she'd let the charade continue. After Mrs. Calloway left, Eleanor sank into a chair, her hands shaking slightly. "It's working. People are already treating me differently." "Told you." Colt opened the basket, revealing golden biscuits that made Eleanor's mouth water. "Might as well enjoy the benefits while we can." They ate breakfast in companionable silence, and Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly. Colt wasn't demanding or invasive. He gave her space, seemed content to let her set the pace of their interactions. It was more consideration than she'd expected from a stranger. "I should get to work," Eleanor said finally, standing to clear the dishes. "The shop won't run itself." "Mind if I take a look at that porch?" "If you insist. Tools are in the shed out back." As Eleanor moved into the front room that served as her shop, she heard Colt head outside. Through the window, she watched him examine the porch, with the careful attention of someone who actually knew what he was doing. He tested boards, checked the support posts, and then disappeared around the side of the house toward the shed. Eleanor tried to focus on her work. She had a hem to finish for Mrs. Cooper and some mending that had been sitting too long, but she kept glancing outside. There was something mesmerizing about watching Colt work. He moved with efficient confidence, each action purposeful and skilled. When he stripped off his shirt in the warming morning sun, Eleanor found herself staring at the play of muscles across his back and shoulders. She forced herself to look away, heat flooding her cheeks. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. The sound of hammering filled the air as Colt began repairs on the porch. It was a good sound, productive and honest. Eleanor settled into her sewing, letting the familiar rhythm of needle through fabric calm her nerves. She was so focused on her work that she didn't hear the shop door open. "Well, well, looks like congratulations are in order." Eleanor's head snapped up, her blood running cold. Standing in her doorway was Thomas Beckett, the man she'd been expecting on yesterday's train, the real William Hartford. He was exactly as he had described himself in his letters. Average height, brown hair thinning at the temples, spectacles perched on a narrow nose. He wore a clerk's suit, rumpled from travel, and carried a leather satchel. Everything about him screamed ordinary, forgettable, safe, except for his eyes. They were cold and calculating as they swept over Eleanor's shop, lingering on the wedding dress still hanging on the wall. Mr. Hartford, Eleanor managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I can explain. Can you? Thomas stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded ominous. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you married someone else. Someone who isn't me. It was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Eleanor's mind raced, trying to figure out how much to tell him. The man I married, he had my letter, and everyone assumed he was me. Thomas's laugh was bitter. How convenient. Tell me, Miss Price, or should I say Mrs. Avery, did you know he wasn't William Hartford when you said your vows? Eleanor's silence was answer enough. I see. Thomas removed his spectacles, cleaning them on his handkerchief with deliberate movements. So you knowingly married a stranger rather than honoring your commitment to me. I traveled all this way, made arrangements, turned down other opportunities because I thought I had a bride waiting. Instead, I arrived to find you've made a fool of me. That wasn't my intention, Eleanor said, finding her voice. I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing, but for nothing? Thomas replaced his spectacles, and Eleanor saw real anger in his eyes now. Do you have any idea what this cost me? Not just the train fare, but the lost wages, the inconvenience, the humiliation of having to explain to my employer why I needed time off. I'll pay you back, Eleanor said desperately, though she had no idea how. For the train fare, at least. You can what? Sew me some dresses? Thomas's voice dripped with contempt. I don't want your money, Miss Price. I want what was promised to me. A wife, a home, a fresh start. The hammering outside had stopped, and Eleanor became aware of Colt's presence in the doorway connecting the shop to her living space. He must have heard voices and come to investigate. His shirt was back on but unbuttoned, and there was a wariness in his eyes that made Eleanor's stomach clench. Thomas saw him and sneered. Ah, the replacement husband. Tell me, did she trap you into this, or were you a willing participant in this farce? Who the hell are you? Colt's voice was dangerously quiet. William Hartford, the man Eleanor was actually supposed to marry. Thomas turned back to Eleanor. Did you tell him about me? About our arrangement? It wasn't like that, Eleanor said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. Colt's expression didn't change, but Eleanor saw something flicker in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe? Or betrayal. Eleanor? I can explain, she said again, hating how pathetic she sounded. Can you explain why you led me on? Thomas demanded. Why you made promises in your letters that you had no intention of keeping? I did intend to keep them. Eleanor's fear was transforming into anger now. I wrote to you in good faith, Mr. Hartford. I was ready to marry you. But then there was a mix-up, and a mix-up you could have corrected at any point, Thomas interrupted. But you didn't, did you? You saw an opportunity and you took it. This cowboy was probably more appealing than a clerk, more exciting, so you threw me over without a second thought. That's not true, isn't it? Thomas moved closer, and Eleanor instinctively stepped back. You know what I think? I think you're a manipulator and a liar. You use men to get what you want, and when you're done with them, you discard them like yesterday's newspaper. That's enough. Colt's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He moved between Eleanor and Thomas, his body language radiating controlled threat. You need to leave. Or what? You'll make me? Thomas laughed, but there was nervousness in it now. Up close, the difference in the two men's builds was obvious. This is between me and my intended bride. She's not your bride. She's my wife. Colt's tone was flat, final. And you're going to walk out of here right now before this gets ugly. For a moment, Eleanor thought Thomas might actually try to fight. His hands clenched into fists, his face flushing red with rage. But then he seemed to remember himself, smoothing down his jacket and adjusting his spectacles. Fine, I'll leave, but this isn't over. Thomas pointed at Eleanor, his finger shaking. You broke a contract, Miss Price, a written agreement. I could take you to court for this, sue you for breach of promise. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She'd heard of breach of promise suits, men suing women who'd broken off engagements, claiming damages for humiliation and lost prospects. If Thomas pursued it, she'd have legal fees she couldn't afford. A scandal that would destroy what little reputation she had left, and possibly a judgment against her that would force her to sell everything. "Get out," Colt said again, his voice harder now. Thomas gave them both a look of pure contempt, then stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. In the ringing silence that followed, Eleanor sank onto her sewing chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her weight. She could feel Colt staring at her, but she couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. "So," Colt said finally, "William Hartford, your mail-order husband." "Yes." There was no point in denying it now. "Were you going to tell me about him?" "I didn't think he'd come. The train was yesterday. He should have been on it. I thought maybe he'd changed his mind or something had happened." Eleanor trailed off, knowing how weak it sounded. Colt crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. What did he mean about a written agreement? Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. "We exchanged letters. In mine, I agreed to marry him in exchange for financial security. In his, he agreed to provide that security in exchange for a wife and a home. It's not a legal contract exactly, but it's enough that he could make trouble for you if he wanted to." Colt's jaw tightened. "Is that why you went through with the wedding yesterday? Because you were afraid of what would happen if you didn't have a husband when he arrived?" "No, I told you. I thought he was on yesterday's train. I thought I'd missed him or he'd missed me, and everyone was so happy, and I just—" Eleanor finally looked up at Colt, desperate for him to understand. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I made a mistake." "You made several mistakes." Colt's voice was hard. "But the biggest one was not being honest with me from the start." "I know, you're right. I should have told you everything." Eleanor stood, wrapping her arms around herself. "If you want to leave, I understand. This isn't your problem." Colt was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor braced herself for him to walk out. She wouldn't blame him. This whole situation had gotten far more complicated than either of them had bargained for. "Did you love him?" Colt asked suddenly. The question caught Eleanor off guard. "What?" "Hartford. Did you love him?" "I'd never met him. How could I love him?" "Then why agree to marry him in the first place?" Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You saw my house, my shop, my life. What do you think? I needed security. He needed a wife. It was a transaction, nothing more. And what about me? Am I just another transaction?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Eleanor didn't know how to navigate. "I don't know what you are," she admitted quietly. "Yesterday you were a stranger doing me a kindness. Today you're my husband in the eyes of the law and this town. Tomorrow—" She shrugged helplessly. "I don't know what tomorrow brings." Colt studied her for another long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "I'm not leaving." Eleanor's heart stuttered. "What?" "Hartford's right about one thing. You broke an agreement with him. If he pursues a breach of promise suit, you'll need a husband to show the court that you had good reason to break it off, that you were already married to someone else. But we're not really married, not in any way that matters. We said vows in front of witnesses, we signed papers. In the eyes of the law, we're as married as any couple." Colt moved closer, his blue eyes intense. "Look, I don't like being lied to, but I understand why you did it, and I'm not going to abandon you to face this alone." "Why?" Eleanor asked, the question that had been haunting her since yesterday. "Why do you keep helping me?" Colt's expression shuddered, that wall coming up again. "I told you, I know what it's like to need help. There's more to it than that. There has to be." For a moment, Eleanor thought he might actually tell her. She saw something raw and painful flicker across his face, some old wound that hadn't quite healed, but then he shook his head. "Maybe someday I'll tell you the whole story, but not today." He turned toward the door. "I'm going to finish fixing that porch. You should probably think about what you're going to do if Hartford really does try to sue you." He left before Eleanor could respond, and she heard the hammering resume a moment later, harder and faster than before. Eleanor sank back onto her chair, her mind reeling. In less than 24 hours, her simple plan to find security through a mail-order marriage had turned into a tangled web of deception, legal threats, and a fake marriage to a man with secrets as deep as her own. And the worst part? She had no idea how to untangle any of it. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety. Eleanor tried to work, but her hand shook too badly to sew a straight seam. She kept replaying Thomas Hartford's words, his threats, the cold calculation in his eyes. Would he really sue her? Could he? Outside, Colt worked steadily on the porch, the rhythmic sound of his hammer oddly comforting despite the tension between them. When Mrs. Henderson stopped by in the afternoon to discuss Sally's dress, Eleanor pulled herself together enough to take measurements and discuss fabric choices. The older woman was warm and friendly, treating Eleanor with a respect she hadn't received in years. "It's so wonderful to see you settled, dear," Mrs. Henderson said as she prepared to leave. "Your husband seems like a good man, very hard-working." Through the window they could both see Colt, shirtless again in the afternoon heat, hauling lumber from the shed. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, the word catching in her throat. "He is." After Mrs. Henderson left, Eleanor stood at the window for a long time, watching Colt work. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own body, his muscles shifting beneath sun-bronzed skin. There was something almost hypnotic about it, and Eleanor found herself wondering about the scars she could see even from this distance, a long one across his ribs, several smaller ones on his back. What kind of life had Colt Avery lived before he stepped off that train into hers? As if sensing her gaze, Colt looked up. Their eyes met through the glass, and Eleanor's breath caught. Even from here, even after everything, she felt that pull between them. It was dangerous and foolish and completely inappropriate, but it was real. Colt held her gaze for a long moment, then returned to his work. Eleanor turned away from the window, pressing her hands to her heated cheeks. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. She couldn't afford to develop feelings for a man who would be gone in a week. But as the afternoon faded into evening, as she prepared a simple supper and set the table for two, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late for such warnings. When Colt came inside, cleaned up and wearing his shirt buttoned properly, they ate in silence. The easy companionship of breakfast was gone, replaced by an awkwardness that made every bite taste like sawdust. "Porch is done," Colt said finally. "Should hold through the winter at least." "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "I said I would." More silence. Eleanor pushed food around her plate, trying to find words that might bridge the distance that had opened between them. "I really am sorry," she said quietly. "About not telling you about Hartford. About all of this." Colt set down his fork, meeting her eyes. "I believe you." "But you're still angry." Colt seemed to search for the right word. "Concerned. Hartford doesn't seem like the type to let this go. And if he does cause trouble, it's going to get messy." "I know." Eleanor's voice was small. "Maybe I should just offer him money, try to settle this before it gets worse." "You said yourself you don't have money." "I could take out a loan or sell some of my equipment." "And then what?" "You'll be in even worse shape than before." Colt leaned back in his chair, studying her. "There has to be another way." "Like what?" "I don't know yet. But running yourself deeper into debt to pay off a man who feels entitled to you? That's not a solution, Eleanor. That's just trading one cage for another." The words hit harder than Eleanor expected, maybe because they were true. She'd spent 3 years trying to escape the trap of poverty and debt, only to nearly walk into another one with William Hartford. And now, trying to escape Hartford, she was considering making everything worse. "I don't know what else to do," she admitted, hating the helplessness in her voice. Colt reached across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, solid and real. "We'll figure it out," he said, "together." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, something tightening in her chest. "Why are you being so kind to me? After everything?" "Because kindness isn't conditional, Eleanor. At least it shouldn't be." Colt's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gentle gesture that made her shiver. "You made a mistake. So did I, agreeing to this charade without asking more questions. But we're in it now, and the only way through is together." Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist that he didn't owe her anything, that he should save himself and leave while he still could. But the warmth of his hand, the steadiness in his eyes, the promise of not being alone in this mess, it was too tempting to resist. "Together," she echoed, and for the first time since Thomas Hartford had walked into her shop, Eleanor felt like maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. They finished supper in more comfortable silence, and afterward Colt helped her wash the dishes. It was domestic and strange and oddly perfect, standing side by side at the wash basin, their hands occasionally brushing in the soapy water. "I should probably check on Dakota," Colt said as they dried the last plate. "Make sure he's settled for the night." Dakota was Colt's horse, the beautiful bay gelding that was worth more than everything Eleanor owned combined. She'd offered to let Colt stable him in her small barn, and he'd accepted gratefully. "Of course, I'll just—" Eleanor gestured vaguely at her sewing table, where the hem she still needed to finish waited. Colt nodded and headed for the door, but paused with his hand on the knob. "Eleanor?" "Yes?" "For what it's worth, I don't think you're a manipulator or a liar. I think you're a woman trying to survive in a world that doesn't make it easy. There's no shame in that." Before Eleanor could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart pounding. She moved to the window and watched Colt cross the yard to the barn, his long strides eating up the distance. When he disappeared inside, she finally allowed herself to breathe. This was supposed to be simple. A week of pretending, and then Colt would leave and life would return to normal. But nothing about this felt simple anymore. Eleanor returned to her sewing, trying to lose herself in the familiar work. But her mind kept wandering to Colt, the way he had defended her against Thomas, the steadiness of his presence, the warmth of his hand in hers. She barely knew him, and yet she felt safer with him than she had with anyone since her father died. It was dangerous, this growing attachment. Colt had his own secrets, his own reasons for helping her that he wouldn't share, and in less than a week, he'd be gone, leaving her to face whatever consequences remained. But for tonight, with Colt just across the yard and the house feeling less empty than it had in years, Eleanor allowed herself to hope. Maybe kindness really wasn't conditional. Maybe, just maybe, she'd accidentally married exactly the right man after all. Even if it couldn't last, even if it was built on mistakes and misunderstandings, tonight it felt real. And that was enough. 3 days passed in an uneasy rhythm that felt almost like normal life. If normal life included a fake husband sleeping on your settee and the constant threat of legal action hanging over your head, Eleanor found herself falling into patterns with Colt that shouldn't have felt so natural, but somehow did. Sharing morning coffee, working side by side in companionable silence, eating simple meals together as the October light faded to dusk. Colt had moved beyond the porch to other repairs around the property. He fixed the leak in Eleanor's roof, replaced 3 rotted boards in the barn, and somehow convinced her stubborn water pump to stop sputtering. Each evening, he'd come inside with sawdust in his hair and tired satisfaction in his eyes, and each evening Eleanor would find herself looking forward to his presence more than she should. They hadn't spoken again about Thomas Hartford, though the threat of him lurked in the background like gathering storm clouds. Eleanor kept expecting him to appear with legal papers or make good on his threats, but so far there'd been only silence. It made her more nervous than any confrontation would have. The town, meanwhile, had fully embraced the fiction of their marriage. Mrs. Calloway stopped by at least once a day with some offering or another, preserves, bread. Once a startlingly ugly doily, she insisted would brighten up Eleanor's parlor. Mr. Peterson had actually smiled when Eleanor came into the general store, extending her credit without the usual lecture about responsibility. And Sally Henderson had commissioned not 1, but 2 new dresses, chattering excitedly about how her mother thought Eleanor's work was more refined than the Deadwood seamstress. It was everything Eleanor had hoped for when she'd written that first letter to William Hartford. Respectability, security, a place in the community that didn't revolve around pity. And it was all built on a lie that would crumble the moment Colt Avery stepped onto that train at the end of the week. On the 4th morning, Eleanor woke to voices drifting up from downstairs. Male voices, plural. She dressed quickly, her heart hammering, and hurried down to find Colt standing in her doorway, talking to a man she'd never seen before. He was older than Colt, maybe 50, with iron gray hair and a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Everything about him radiated authority and danger, from the well-worn Colt revolver on his hip to the cold assessment in his eyes as they swept over Eleanor's small house. "Ma'am," the marshal said, tipping his hat. Marshal James Pritchard. Sorry to disturb you so early, but I need to speak with your husband. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She looked at Colt, searching his face for some explanation, but his expression was carefully neutral. What's this about, Marshal? Colt's voice was calm, but Eleanor heard the tension underneath. Just routine questions. There's been some trouble up north, cattle rustling, property damage. I'm talking to everyone who's passed through the area in the last few months. Pritchard's eyes never left Colt's face. You said you work at the Double R Ranch. That's right. Been there about 2 years. And before that? Something flickered across Colt's face, gone so quickly Eleanor might have imagined it. Drifted around, worked a few different spreads in Wyoming and Montana. Uh-huh. Pritchard pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages. You wouldn't happen to know anything about a man named Cole Avery, would you? Notice the similarity in names? Eleanor's stomach dropped. The way Pritchard said it, the emphasis on Cole versus Colt, this wasn't a coincidence. Never heard of him, Colt said, but his jaw was tight. Strange, because Cole Avery is wanted for cattle theft in 3 territories, last spotted near Deadwood about 3 weeks ago. Pritchard's smile didn't reach his eyes. And here you are, Colt Avery, traveling from Deadwood to Dakota Junction right around that same time. Quite a coincidence. My husband isn't a criminal, Eleanor heard herself say, stepping forward. Her voice shook but held firm. He's been here with me. We just got married. So I heard. Pritchard's gaze shifted to her, assessing. Congratulations, Mrs. Avery, though I have to say it's interesting timing. Man shows up out of nowhere, marries quickly, starts using a slightly different name. I'm not using a different name, Colt said, his voice hardening. I've always been Colt Avery. You want to verify that? Wire the Double R Ranch. Talk to my boss, Frank Richardson. He'll tell you. Oh, I intend to. Pritchard tucked his notebook away. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you stayed in Dakota Junction. Don't go anywhere without letting me know first. Are you arresting him? Eleanor demanded. Not yet, but I'm watching him. Pritchard tipped his hat again. Good day, Mrs. Avery, Mr. Avery. The marshal left, and Eleanor immediately rounded on Colt. What was that about? Who's Cole Avery? Colt moved to the window, watching Pritchard mount his horse and ride off. Exactly who he said. A cattle thief wanted in 3 territories. And you just happen to have almost the same name? Eleanor, don't. She held up a hand, her mind racing. Yesterday you were defending me against accusations of being a liar. Now I find out a U.S. Marshal is looking for someone with your name, asking about crimes committed near where you were just a few weeks ago, and you expect me to believe this is all coincidence? Colt turned from the window, and for the first time since she'd met him, Eleanor saw real fear in his eyes. I need you to trust me. Trust you? I don't even know you. I don't know anything about you except that you're good with your hands, and you have a past you won't talk about. And apparently the law is interested in your whereabouts. Eleanor's voice rose with each word. You could be this Cole Avery for all I know. You could be using me as some kind of cover while you hide from the law. I'm not using you, Colt took a step toward her, hands raised placatingly. Yes, I have a past. Yes, there are things I haven't told you, but I am not Cole Avery the cattle thief, and I am not using you as cover. Then who are you, really? Colt was silent for a long moment, warring with himself. Eleanor could see it in his face, the desire to tell her fighting against years of practiced secrecy. My real name is Colt Avery, he said finally. But you're right that there are things I haven't told you. Things I didn't think mattered because I was only going to be here a week. What things? Colt moved to the settee, sinking onto it like a man carrying a heavy weight. 3 years ago, my younger brother got sick, real sick, fever that wouldn't break, couldn't keep food down, couldn't work. We didn't have money for a doctor, and the ranch we were working on wouldn't give me an advance. Eleanor sat down slowly in her sewing chair, sensing this was a story Colt had never told anyone. So I did what I had to do, Colt continued, his voice flat. I took 20 head of cattle from the ranch and sold them in the next town over. Used the money to get Sam, my brother, to a doctor. The medicine worked. He lived. But you were caught. Eventually. The ranch owner filed charges. I served 6 months in territorial prison, then got out on good behavior. Colt looked at his hands, scarred and calloused from years of hard work. When I got out, I found out Sam had moved back east, wanted nothing to do with me. Said I'd embarrassed him, made him look bad. Haven't heard from him since. Eleanor's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Don't be. I made my choice. I'd make it again if I had to. Colt met her eyes. But that's why I understand what you're doing, Eleanor. Why you wrote to William Hartford. Why you went through with a wedding to a stranger. When you're desperate, when you're just trying to survive, you do what you have to do, even if it means breaking rules, even if it means other people don't understand. But you served your time, Eleanor said. You paid your debt. Why would this Marshall Pritchard be interested in you now? Because someone's using my name. Colt's jaw tightened. This Cole Avery he's looking for, I'd bet my last dollar it's someone who knows about my past, who's using a similar name to throw the law off their trail. Maybe someone I knew in prison. Maybe someone from one of the ranches I worked after I got out. But it's not me. Eleanor wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But doubt gnawed at her. How do I know you're telling the truth? Colt stood, moving to his saddlebags by the door. He rummaged through them and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He handed it to Eleanor. It was a release form from the territorial prison, dated 2.5 years ago. Colt James Avery, released on good behavior after serving 6 months for cattle theft. The signature at the bottom was official, the seal unmistakable. I keep it as a reminder, Colt said quietly, of what desperation can make you do, of what it costs. Eleanor stared at the paper, her hands trembling. You should have told me this from the beginning. Maybe. But would you have let me stay if you knew I was an ex-convict? Would you have trusted me alone in your house? Eleanor didn't answer because they both knew the truth. She wouldn't have. Fear would have overridden kindness, and Colt would have been back on the street, just another stranger passing through. The marshal said to stay in town, Eleanor said finally. What are you going to do? Exactly what I told him. Wire the double R. Get Frank to vouch for me. He knows I've been working there steady for 2 years, knows I haven't been rustling cattle or causing trouble. Colt took the paper back, folding it carefully. It'll clear up once Pritchard does his research. And if it doesn't? Colt's expression hardened. Then I'll deal with it. But Eleanor, I need you to know, whatever happens, I'm not going to let this blow back on you. If Pritchard decides to arrest me, I'll tell him the truth about our marriage, that it was a mistake, that you didn't know anything about my past. I'll make sure you're protected. I don't want your protection. The words burst out of Eleanor before she could stop them. I want the truth. I want to know who you really are and what I've gotten myself into and whether I'm going to end up in even worse trouble than I started with. You want the truth? Colt's voice rose to match hers. The truth is, I'm a man who made a bad choice to save someone I loved. The truth is, I paid for that choice, and I'm still paying for it because people look at me and see a criminal instead of someone who was desperate. The truth is, I should have left Dakota Junction the moment that Reverend called my name, but I didn't because for some damn reason I couldn't walk away from you. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and more revealing than anything Colt had said before. Why? Eleanor whispered. Why couldn't you walk away? Colt laughed, but there was no humor in it. Hell if I know. Maybe because you looked as lost as I felt. Maybe because helping you felt like a chance to do something good for once instead of just surviving. Maybe because when you kissed me at that altar, I felt something I haven't felt in years. Eleanor's breath caught. What did you feel? Like maybe I wasn't just a mistake waiting to happen. Like maybe I could be someone worth staying for. Colt turned away, his shoulders tense. But that's the problem with people like us, Eleanor. We're so used to surviving that we forget what it's like to actually live. We make choices based on fear instead of hope, and we end up trapped in lives we never wanted. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow because they were true. Every decision she'd made since her father's death had been about survival, keeping the house, keeping the business, keeping herself from slipping into complete destitution. She'd written to William Hartford not because she wanted a husband, but because she needed security. She'd married Colt not because she felt anything for him, but because she couldn't face the pity in everyone's eyes. Except that wasn't entirely true anymore, was it? Somewhere in the last 4 days, between morning coffee and evening meals, between watching him work and feeling his hand warm around hers, something had shifted. Eleanor had started to care about Colt Avery, not as a convenient fiction or a temporary solution, but as a person. A complicated, damaged, frustratingly secretive person who fixed her porch and defended her honor and looked at her like she mattered. "I'm scared," Eleanor admitted quietly, "of the Marshal, of Thomas Hartford, of all of this blowing up in my face. But mostly I'm scared of what happens when you leave." Colt turned back to her, surprise flickering across his face. "Eleanor." A sharp knock on the door interrupted whatever he'd been about to say. They stared at each other for a frozen moment, and then Eleanor moved to answer it. Thomas Hartford stood on her newly repaired porch, holding an official-looking envelope. Behind him, looking uncomfortable, was the town's constable. "Miss Price," Thomas said with cold formality, "I'm here to serve you with legal notice." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Legal notice?" Thomas handed her the envelope with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Breach of promise suit. I'm suing you for damages related to our broken engagement. The amount I'm seeking is $3,000, enough to cover my lost wages, travel expenses, and compensation for the emotional distress and public humiliation you've caused me." $3,000. Eleanor would have laughed if she wasn't so terrified. She didn't have $300, let alone $3,000. "You can't be serious," she breathed. "I'm completely serious. I made an arrangement with you in good faith, and you violated that arrangement. The law entitles me to compensation." Thomas's eyes flickered to Colt, who'd appeared in the doorway behind Eleanor. "Unless, of course, you'd like to propose an alternative settlement." "What kind of settlement?" Eleanor asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. "Dissolve this farce of a marriage. Marry me as originally agreed. I'll drop the suit, we'll tell everyone there was a misunderstanding that's now been cleared up, and we can move forward with our arrangement." "Absolutely not," Colt said flatly. Thomas ignored him, keeping his eyes on Eleanor. "Think carefully, Miss Price. $3,000 is more than your house is worth, more than your business is worth. If I win this suit, and I will win, you'll lose everything, or you can do the sensible thing and honor your original commitment." The constable shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I have to formally serve you these papers. You'll have 2 weeks to respond before the hearing." Eleanor took the envelope with numb fingers. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. "You have until tomorrow to make your decision," Thomas said. "After that, we proceed to court." He turned and walked away, the constable following with an apologetic glance back at Eleanor. The moment they were gone, Eleanor's legs gave out. She would have fallen if Colt hadn't caught her, strong arms wrapping around her waist and guiding her to the settee. "Breathe," he said firmly. "Eleanor, breathe." She tried, but her chest felt tight, compressed by the weight of Thomas's threats and the Marshal's suspicions and the whole impossible mess her life had become. $3,000, she gasped. "I can't pay $3,000. I can't pay $300. I'm going to lose everything." "No, you're not." "How can you say that? You heard him. He's going to win, and I'll—" "Eleanor, look at me." Colt gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "We are not going to let that bastard win. You hear me? We're going to fight this." "With what?" "I don't have money for a lawyer. I don't have money for anything." Tears burned Eleanor's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "Maybe I should just do what he wants. Marry him, end this before it gets worse." "And spend the rest of your life with a man who'd threaten and manipulate you to get what he wants?" Colt's voice was harsh. "That's not a solution, Eleanor. That's surrender." "What choice do I have?" "You have a choice between giving up or fighting back, between letting fear control you or standing your ground." Colt's hands gentled on her shoulders. 3 years ago, I was in a prison cell, convinced my life was over. Everyone I knew had abandoned me, including my own brother. I had nothing, no money, no prospects, no hope. But I made a choice to keep going, to serve my time, get out, and rebuild. It wasn't easy, and it sure as hell wasn't fast, but I did it. "I'm not as strong as you," Eleanor whispered. "Yes, you are. You've been fighting alone for 3 years, keeping your business alive, keeping your home, refusing to give up even when things looked impossible. That takes strength, Eleanor. More strength than most people have." Colt brushed a strand of hair from her face, the gesture unexpectedly tender. You're not alone anymore. We're going to fight this together. Eleanor wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe there was a way out of this nightmare that didn't involve losing everything or marrying a man she despised. But she couldn't see it. How? She asked. How do we fight someone who has the law on his side? Colt was quiet for a moment, thinking. Hartford's suit is based on you breaking an engagement, right? But you didn't break an engagement. You married someone else. In the eyes of the law, you had a legitimate reason to end your arrangement with him. But our marriage is legal, Colt interrupted. Completely legal. We said vows, signed papers, consummated. He stopped, a flush creeping up his neck. Well, as far as anyone knows, we consummated the marriage. The point is, legally speaking, you didn't jilt Hartford. You were already committed to someone else. Eleanor shook her head. But we weren't. I was waiting for him when you stepped off that train. That's not what the official record shows. The marriage certificate is dated the day before Hartford arrived. As far as any court is concerned, you were already married when he showed up. Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest, fragile but real. You think that would be enough? I think it's our best argument. You can't be sued for breach of promise if you were already married to someone else. Any judge would see that. Colt's expression darkened. The problem is proving our marriage is legitimate and not some scheme you cooked up to avoid marrying Hartford. But it was a scheme, Eleanor said miserably. Not to avoid Hartford. I didn't even know he was coming. But still, if we have to testify under oath, then we tell the truth. That we met by accident, that there was a misunderstanding about who I was, and that we decided to make it work. Colt met her eyes steadily. We don't have to tell them it was supposed to be temporary. We don't have to tell them anything except that we're married and we intend to stay that way. Eleanor's heart stuttered. Stay that way? For as long as it takes to defeat this lawsuit. Colt's voice was careful, measured. I can't leave now anyway, not with Marshal Pritchard watching me. And you need a husband to fight Hartford's claim. So we stay married, at least until all this is settled. It made sense, perfect logical sense. Except for the part where Eleanor's feelings were getting tangled up in what was supposed to be a simple arrangement, and the part where Colt's past was catching up to him, and the part where everything could still fall apart at any moment. What if the marshal arrests you? Eleanor asked. What if he decides you're this Cole Avery he's looking for? Then you'll have even better grounds to dissolve our marriage. Abandonment by a criminal husband. Hartford's suit would be pointless. Colt's smile was bitter. See? Either way, you're protected. I don't want to be protected by you going to prison for something you didn't do. The vehemence in her own voice surprised Eleanor. When had she started caring so much about what happened to Colt Avery? Colt seemed equally surprised. Eleanor, no, listen to me. Eleanor grabbed his hands, holding tight. You've done nothing but help me since the moment we met. You fixed my house, defended my reputation, offered to fight my legal battles. The least I can do is believe you when you say you're innocent. Something shifted in Colt's expression, a wall coming down that Eleanor hadn't even realized was there. You believe me? I believe you. And saying it, Eleanor realized it was true. Despite the secrets and the suspicions and the ex-convict confession, she believed Colt Avery was exactly who he said he was. A man who'd made a desperate choice and paid for it, who was still paying for it, who deserved a chance to prove he was more than his worst moment. Colt pulled her into his arms, and Eleanor went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and breathing in the familiar scent of leather and horses and hard work. His heart beat strong and steady beneath her ear, and for just a moment, Eleanor let herself believe everything would be all right. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Colt murmured into her hair. The struggling seamstress and the ex-convict, married by accident and fighting to keep our heads above water. Eleanor laughed despite everything. When you put it that way, it sounds almost romantic. Does it? Colt pulled back just enough to look at her, and Eleanor's breath caught at the intensity in his blue eyes. Because, from where I'm standing, it feels pretty damn romantic. The air between them changed, charged with something that had been building since that accidental kiss at the altar. Eleanor's pulse hammered as Colt's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. Eleanor, he said, and it was a question and a warning and a promise all at once. She answered by rising up on her toes and kissing him. This kiss was nothing like the chaste peck at their wedding. This was real and desperate, and 3 days of denied attraction finally breaking free. Colt made a sound low in his throat and deepened the kiss, his arms tightening around her waist as Eleanor's fingers tangled in his hair. It felt like falling and flying at the same time. Like every terrible thing that had happened had led to this moment, this man, this impossible connection that shouldn't exist but did. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against hers. "That complicates things," he said roughly. "Everything's already complicated," Eleanor pointed out. "What's one more complication?" Colt laughed, and the sound was warm and real and made Eleanor's heart soar. "Fair point." They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, until reality intruded in the form of voices outside. Eleanor pulled away reluctantly, moving to the window to see Mrs. Calloway approaching with yet another covered basket. "We have company," she said, and Colt groaned. "Of course we do." Eleanor smoothed her dress and hair, trying to compose herself, while Colt did the same. When Mrs. Calloway knocked, they were standing a respectable distance apart, though Eleanor's lips still tingled and Colt's eyes held promises of conversations yet to come. The rest of the day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Eleanor worked on Sally Henderson's dress while Colt rode into town to send his wire to the Double R Ranch. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Marshall's already been there," he said quietly after Mrs. Calloway had finally left. "Pritchard wired ahead asking questions. Frank vouched for me, but Pritchard's not satisfied. He wants more proof." "What kind of proof?" "The kind I don't have. Witnesses who can place me at the ranch during the times these cattle thefts occurred. Documentation of my whereabouts." Colt ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm a ranch hand, Eleanor. I don't exactly keep detailed records of my daily activities." Eleanor's mind raced. "What about the other hands at the ranch? They'd know you were there." "Most of them are seasonal workers scattered to the winds by now, and the ones who are still there—" Colt shook his head. "Ranch hands don't pay much attention to each other. We work, we sleep, we move on. Nobody's going to remember specifically where I was on any given day 3 weeks ago. So what do? We wait. Pritchard's investigation will either clear me or it won't. Until then, I'm stuck here." Colt met her eyes. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I know this isn't what you signed up for. Neither is a breach of promise lawsuit, but here we are." Eleanor moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. "We'll figure it out, both problems. Together." "Together," Colt echoed, and when he pulled her back into his arms, Eleanor went willingly. Outside, the October sun was setting, painting the Dakota sky in shades of gold and crimson. Inside Eleanor's small house, two people who'd married by accident held each other against the gathering dark, trying to believe that somehow, against all odds, they'd find a way through. But neither of them saw the figure watching from across the street, or the satisfied smile on Marshall Pritchard's face as he made notes in his book. The trap was closing, and tomorrow would bring revelations that would shatter everything Eleanor and Colt thought they knew. Eleanor woke to the sound of raised voices, and her heart immediately seized with dread. Dawn had barely broken, the sky outside her window still more gray than gold, but downstairs she could hear Colt's voice, sharp with anger, and another voice she recognized with sinking certainty as Marshall Pritchard's. She dressed with shaking hands, not bothering with her corset, just throwing on her simplest dress and hurrying downstairs. What she saw made her blood run cold. Colt stood in the middle of her parlor, hands raised slightly, while Marshall Pritchard held a revolver pointed squarely at his chest. Behind the marshal stood Thomas Hartford, and the expression on his face was one of smug satisfaction. "What's going on?" Eleanor demanded, her voice coming out stronger than she felt. "Mrs. Avery," Pritchard said without taking his eyes off Colt, "I'm placing your husband under arrest for cattle theft, property destruction, and evading lawful authority." "That's insane! He hasn't done anything." "Haven't I?" Colt's voice was bitter. "Turns out someone's been very busy making sure it looks exactly like I have." Thomas stepped forward, pulling a folded newspaper from his coat. "Perhaps you should see this, Miss Price, since you seem so convinced of your husband's innocence." Eleanor snatched the paper, her eyes scanning the front page. The headline made her stomach drop. Notorious cattle thief strikes again. Cole Avery wanted in 4 territories. Below it was a sketch, rough but unmistakable. It could have been Colt, or it could have been any number of men with similar features. But what caught Eleanor's attention was the description. Scar above left eyebrow, approximately 6 feet tall, rides a bay gelding. That's not proof, Eleanor said, but her voice wavered. Lots of men have scars. Lots of men ride bay horses. Perhaps, Pritchard agreed. But when I wired the authorities in Deadwood, they confirmed that a man matching your husband's description was seen in the area the night before a major theft. And when I checked with the train station here in Dakota Junction, the station master remembered him arriving with saddlebags that seemed unusually heavy. Because they were full of my clothes and personal belongings. Colt's hands curled into fists. This is a setup, Eleanor. Someone's framing me. Or you're exactly what you appear to be, Thomas said smoothly. A criminal using a false marriage to hide from the law. Tell me, Miss Price, did your husband happen to mention his prison record before you married him? Eleanor's silence was answer enough. She saw something flicker in Thomas's eyes, triumph mixed with what might have been genuine concern. He's been using you, Thomas continued, his voice almost gentle now. Can't you see that? He needed a respectable cover, a reason to stay in one place while the law looked elsewhere. What better cover than a wife who's too naive to question him? That's not true, Eleanor said, but doubt crept into her voice despite her best efforts. She looked at Colt, searching his face for reassurance, but what she saw there made her heart sink. Guilt. Not the guilt of a criminal, but the guilt of a man who knew he'd brought danger to someone he cared about. Eleanor, listen to me, Colt said urgently. I know how this looks. I know what you're thinking, but I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, I did not steal those cattle. I did not commit those crimes. Someone is setting me up. Who? Pritchard asked. Give me a name. Give me something to investigate besides the mounting evidence against you. Colt's jaw tightened. I don't know who, but think about it. Why would I use my real name if I was committing crimes? Why would I stay in one place, get married, make myself easy to find? That doesn't make any sense. Unless you're arrogant, Thomas suggested. Unless you thought you were clever enough to hide in plain sight. Or unless I'm telling the truth and someone else is using a name similar to mine to throw off suspicion. Colt turned to Eleanor, desperate now. You know me. You've spent nearly a week with me. Do I seem like a man who's been sneaking off to steal cattle and destroy property? Eleanor wanted to say yes, wanted to defend him with absolute certainty. But the truth was, she didn't know Colt. Not really. She knew he was kind and helpful, that he fixed things and kept his promises, that he kissed like he meant it. But she didn't know where he went when he rode into town, didn't know what he did during the hours they weren't together. She wanted to trust him, but trust was a luxury she'd learned she couldn't afford. I don't know, she whispered, and saw something break in Colt's eyes. Well, I know, Pritchard said. And right now, all the evidence points to you, Mr. Avery. So you're going to come with me peacefully, or we're going to have a problem. Let me get my things, Colt said quietly. I'll accompany you. Pritchard gestured with his revolver toward the door. Mrs. Avery, you'll want to stay here. But Eleanor followed them anyway, watching as Colt gathered his saddlebags from beside the settee. His movements were slow, defeated, and it made Eleanor's chest ache. When he turned back to her, his eyes held 1,000 unspoken words. I'm sorry, he said, for all of this, for dragging you into my mess, for making you care about someone who only brought you trouble. Colt, take care of Dakota for me. He's a good horse. Deserves better than being sold off to pay legal fees. Colt's smile was heartbreaking. And Eleanor? Whatever happens, whatever you hear about me, remember that week we had. Remember that some of it was real. Before Eleanor could respond, Pritchard took Colt's arm and led him toward the door. Thomas followed, pausing only to place a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. You're better off without him, Thomas said quietly. And once this marriage is dissolved due to his criminal activities, we can proceed with our original arrangement. I'm willing to overlook this whole unfortunate incident. Eleanor jerked away from his touch. Get out of my house. Thomas's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Eleanor. That man is going to hang for his crimes, and you're going to be left with nothing. At least with me, you'd have security. I'd rather have nothing than have you. The words came out with more venom than Eleanor knew she possessed. Now get out, before I scream loud enough to wake the whole town. For a moment she thought Thomas might argue, but then he shrugged, straightening his spectacles. Your choice, but don't come crying to me when you lose everything. He left, and Eleanor stood in the sudden silence of her empty house, shaking from head to toe. Through the window, she watched Marshal Pritchard lead Colt down Main Street toward the small jail that served Dakota Junction and the surrounding area. A few early risers were already gathering, drawn by the commotion, and Eleanor could see the speculation in their eyes. This was it, then. The scandal she'd been trying so hard to avoid. By noon, everyone in town would know that Eleanor Price's husband was a criminal, that her marriage was a sham, that she was exactly the foolish, desperate woman they'd always thought she was. Eleanor sank onto the settee, the same settee where Colt had slept for the past week, and let herself cry for the first time since her father died. She cried for her ruined reputation, for her failing business, for the lawsuit she couldn't fight and the debt she couldn't pay. But most of all, she cried for Colt Avery, who'd fixed her porch and believed in her strength and kissed her like she was something precious. She cried because she still didn't know if he was innocent or guilty, and because part of her didn't care. The sun was fully up when Eleanor finally dried her tears and forced herself to think clearly. Sitting here wallowing wouldn't solve anything. She needed information, needed to understand what was really happening. She needed to talk to someone who understood the law. Reverend Marsh wasn't a lawyer, but he'd performed enough marriages and funerals and arbitrations to have a working knowledge of legal matters. Eleanor found him at the church, preparing for Sunday services even though it was only Thursday. Eleanor, my dear, he said, genuine concern in his eyes. I heard about your husband. Terrible business. Reverend, I need your help. Eleanor didn't bother with pleasantries. Thomas Hartford is suing me for breach of promise. But I was already married when he arrived. Doesn't that matter? Reverend Marsh gestured for her to sit in one of the pews. Normally, yes. A prior marriage would be absolute grounds to dismiss such a suit. However, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. If your marriage to Mr. Avery is found to be fraudulent in any way, or if it's dissolved due to his criminal activities, then Hartford's suit would proceed as if the marriage never existed. Eleanor's stomach sank. So if Colt is convicted, then legally you were never truly married. Hartford could argue that you entered into the marriage knowing it wouldn't last, specifically to avoid honoring your commitment to him. Reverend Marsh patted her hand sympathetically. I'm sorry, my dear. I wish I had better news. Eleanor left the church feeling worse than when she'd arrived. Every path forward seemed to lead to disaster. If Colt was convicted, she'd lose her defense against Hartford's suit and probably lose everything. If Colt was somehow cleared, she'd still be married to a man the whole town now suspected of being a criminal, which would destroy her reputation just as thoroughly. She was trapped, with no good options and no way out. As Eleanor walked back toward her house, she saw a familiar figure waiting on her porch. Sally Henderson, clutching a basket and looking nervous. Mrs. Avery, Sally said hesitantly, I hope you don't mind my stopping by. I wanted to bring you some bread. Thought you might not feel like cooking today. The kindness made Eleanor's throat tight. Thank you, Sally. That's very thoughtful. I also wanted to say, Sally twisted the basket handle in her hands. I don't believe what they're saying about your husband. Mr. Avery seemed like a good man. Kind. My mother says you can always tell a man's character by how he treats people who can't do anything for him. And he was always polite to me, even though I'm nobody important. You are important, Sally. Eleanor took the basket, genuinely moved. And thank you for saying that about Colt. It means more than you know. After Sally left, Eleanor went inside and forced herself to eat some of the bread, even though it tasted like dust in her mouth. She needed to keep her strength up, needed to think clearly. There had to be something she could do, some way to prove Colt's innocence, or at least raise enough doubt to get the charges dropped. She was still trying to formulate a plan when another knock came at her door. This time it was Mrs. Calloway, but her usual cheerful expression was replaced with something harder. Eleanor, dear, I think we need to have a frank conversation. Eleanor invited her in, bracing herself for judgment. I've been talking with the other ladies in town, Mrs. Calloway began, settling onto the settee with the air of someone delivering difficult news. And we're all quite concerned about your situation. This marriage of yours, it seems it wasn't quite what you led us to believe. I never lied about anything, Eleanor said defensively. Perhaps not outright, but you certainly didn't mention that your husband was a criminal on the run from the law. Mrs. Calloway's expression was stern. That kind of deception reflects poorly on you, dear, and on all of us who vouched for you and welcomed you into respectable society. Colt isn't a criminal. He's being framed. So he says, but the marshal seems quite convinced of his guilt. Mrs. Calloway stood, smoothing her skirts. I'm sorry, Eleanor, but until this matter is resolved, I think it would be best if you didn't attend church services or social gatherings. Your presence would be awkward. The word stung like a slap. You're shunning me. We're protecting our reputations. Surely you understand. Mrs. Calloway moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I do feel sorry for you. You were taken in by a charming scoundrel, just like so many foolish women before you, but that doesn't mean we all need to suffer the consequences of your poor judgment. After she left, Eleanor sat in numb silence. In less than 6 hours, she'd gone from respected married woman to social pariah. And the worst part was knowing it would only get worse. The rest of the day passed in a blur of similar visits. Mr. Peterson stopped by to inform her that he'd need payment on her account immediately, no more credit until her situation was clarified. The woman who'd commissioned a dress for the Christmas social sent a note withdrawing her order. Even young Sally's mother came by to politely but firmly suggest that Sally shouldn't be seen associating with Eleanor anymore. By evening, Eleanor felt like she'd been stripped bare, every bit of progress she'd made in the past week erased in a single morning. She was sitting in the dark, unable to muster the energy to light a lamp, when she heard a sound from the barn. Her first thought was that someone was stealing Dakota, and she grabbed her father's old rifle from above the fireplace and ran outside. What she found was Colt, standing in the barn doorway with his hands raised. "Don't shoot," he said with a weak attempt at humor. "I'm already in enough trouble." Eleanor lowered the rifle, her hands shaking. "How are you here? Did you escape?" "Pritchard let me go, temporarily." Colt moved closer, and in the moonlight, Eleanor could see exhaustion etched into every line of his face. New evidence came in. Seems there was another theft last night while I was locked up. Same signature, same description of the thief. Pritchard's having to reconsider his assumptions. Relief flooded through Eleanor so powerfully it made her knees weak. "So you're cleared?" "Not exactly. Pritchard thinks I might have an accomplice, someone who committed last night's theft to provide me with an alibi. He let me out because he doesn't have enough evidence to hold me, but he's not done investigating." Colt ran a hand through his hair, looking defeated. "Eleanor, I came to tell you something. I'm leaving." The words hit like a physical blow. "What?" "I'm leaving Dakota Junction, tonight, as soon as I can saddle Dakota and gather my things." Colt's eyes were dark with pain. "I can't stay here. Can't keep dragging you down with me. You were right to doubt me this morning. You barely know me, and I've brought you nothing but trouble." "That's not true, isn't it? Look at what's happened since I arrived. Your reputation is ruined. You're being sued. You're being shunned by the town. All because you made the mistake of marrying me." Colt stepped closer, and Eleanor could see the raw emotion in his face. "You deserve better than this, Eleanor. Better than me. And what about the lawsuit? If you leave, I'll have no defense against Thomas's claim. Tell them the truth. That I tricked you, that you didn't know about my past, that the marriage was never consummated. Get an annulment on grounds of fraud. It'll be messy, but you'll survive it." Colt's voice cracked. "You're stronger than you think you are." Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. After everything they'd been through, after the kiss they'd shared and the promises they'd made, he was just going to run? "You're a coward," she said quietly. Colt flinched like she'd struck him. "What?" "You heard me. You're a coward." Eleanor's voice grew stronger, fueled by anger and hurt and desperate fear. 3 years ago, you made a hard choice and you paid for it. You went to prison, you served your time, you rebuilt your life. You told me that took strength, that it took courage. But now, when things get difficult, you're running away. I'm trying to protect you. I don't need your protection. I need you to stay and fight. Eleanor grabbed his shirt, holding on tight. Do you think leaving will solve anything? The damage is already done. Whether you're here or not, I'm still the woman who married a suspected criminal. I'm still being sued. I'm still facing ruin. The only difference is whether I face it alone or with someone beside me. Colt covered her hands with his, and Eleanor felt them trembling. Eleanor, if I stay, it's only going to get worse. Pritchard is convinced I'm guilty. Even if he can't prove it now, he'll keep looking, and Hartford will use that against you in court. Then let him! Eleanor pulled Colt closer, rising up on her toes so she could look him directly in the eyes. I would rather fight and lose with you than win by betraying you, because that's what it would be. A betrayal. Of you, of myself, of everything we've built this week. We've built a fantasy based on a mistake. No, Eleanor said fiercely. We've built something real out of an accident. There's a difference. That first day, yes, it was a mistake. But every day since, every choice we've made to stay, to help each other, to care about each other, those weren't mistakes. Those were choices. Eleanor, I love you, she said, the words bursting out before she could stop them. I know it's insane. I know it doesn't make any sense. We've known each other less than a week, and most of that week has been built on lies and misunderstandings. But somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, I fell in love with you. With your kindness and your strength and the way you look at me like I'm worth something. So don't you dare run away now. Don't you dare take the coward's way out and leave me to face this alone. Colt stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been wonder. You love me? Yes. You stubborn, secretive, frustratingly noble man. I love you. Eleanor's voice broke. And I think you love me too, even if you're too scared to admit it. For a long moment, Colt didn't move, didn't speak. Then slowly, he pulled Eleanor into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. You're right, he whispered into her hair. I am scared, terrified actually, because I do love you, Eleanor Price Avery. I loved you when you stood on that platform looking nervous and hopeful. I loved you when you kissed me at the altar like you were taking a leap of faith. I loved you when you defended me to Hartford and Pritchard, even when you had every reason to doubt me. He pulled back just enough to frame her face with his hands. I love you so much it scares the hell out of me, because everyone I've ever loved has left me. My brother, my parents, everyone. And I thought if I left first, it would hurt less. Would it? Eleanor asked softly. No, Colt admitted. It would destroy me. Then stay. Eleanor pressed her forehead to his. Stay and fight with me. We'll face Hartford together. We'll prove your innocence together. And if we fail, if we lose everything, at least we'll have each other. That's not much of a consolation. It's everything. Eleanor kissed him, pouring all her fear and hope and desperate love into it. You're everything. Colt kissed her back with an intensity that made Eleanor's head spin. This wasn't like their previous kisses, tentative and questioning. This was definitive, a claiming and a promise, and a choice all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against hers. All right, I'll stay. But Eleanor, you need to know, if Pritchard arrests me again, if this goes to trial and I'm convicted, there's a good chance I'll hang. Cattle theft is a hanging offense in most territories. The word sent ice through Eleanor's veins, but she forced herself to be brave. Then we'll make sure that doesn't happen. And how do we do that? I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out. Eleanor took Colt's hand, lacing her fingers through his. Together. They stood there in the barn, holding each other as the night deepened around them, trying to believe that love and determination would be enough to save them from the forces arrayed against them. Neither of them saw Thomas Hartford watching from the shadows at the edge of Eleanor's property, his expression unreadable. Neither of them knew that he'd heard every word of their conversation, or that he was already formulating a new plan, and neither of them suspected that the real Cole Avery, the cattle thief Marshall Pritchard had been hunting, was closer than they imagined, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The night was cold, And inside Eleanor's small house, she and Colt finally gave in to the feelings they'd been fighting since that first accidental kiss. They made love slowly, carefully, as if they were both afraid the other might disappear if they moved too fast. Afterward, lying tangled together in Eleanor's small bed, Colt traced patterns on her skin and told her stories about his childhood, about his brother Sam, about the dreams he'd had before prison had taught him to stop dreaming. Eleanor told him about her father, about the weight of his debts and the loneliness of the past 3 years. She told him about the woman she'd been before desperation had made her hard, about the hopes she'd buried because they hurt too much to carry. "I wanted to be a designer," she admitted quietly. "Not just a seamstress doing alterations and mending. I wanted to create beautiful things, original things. My father used to say I had an artist's soul." "You still do," Colt said, kissing her temple. "I've seen your work, Eleanor. Those dresses you make are art. Art doesn't pay the bills." "Maybe it should." Colt pulled her closer. "When this is all over, when we've beaten Hartford and cleared my name, maybe we could go somewhere new. Somewhere nobody knows us. You could design dresses. I could work with horses. We could start fresh." It was a beautiful dream, and Eleanor let herself believe in it for just a moment. A life where she wasn't defined by her debts and Colt wasn't haunted by his past. A life where they were just two people who loved each other, building something real. But dreams didn't change reality. And reality came crashing back with the dawn. Eleanor woke to shouting and the sound of breaking glass. She bolted upright, Colt already halfway out of bed and reaching for his gun belt. "Stay here," he commanded, but Eleanor ignored him, grabbing her dressing gown and following him downstairs. The front window of her shop had been shattered, glass littering the floor, and painted across her wall in crude red letters were the words, "Criminal's Whore." Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth, horror and shame washing over her in equal measure. Beside her, Colt's face had gone dangerously still. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Does it matter?" Eleanor's voice shook. "This is what the town thinks of me now. Of us." Before Colt could respond, they heard the sound of hoofbeats. Through the broken window, they saw Marshal Pritchard riding up with 3 other men. Behind them, a crowd was gathering. It seemed like half the town had turned out, drawn by the commotion. Pritchard dismounted, his expression grim. "Mr. Avery, I need you to come with me." "What now?" Colt demanded. "You said I was free to go." "That was before this." Pritchard held up a leather saddlebag, and Eleanor's blood ran cold as she recognized it. It was similar to Colt's, but not quite the same. "We found this hidden in your barn, Mr. Avery. Care to explain why it's full of stolen property and money from the Deadwood bank robbery last week?" "That's not mine," Colt said flatly. "I've never seen that bag before." "Funny, because it has your initials burned into the leather, C.A." Pritchard's expression was hard. "Colt Avery. Or should I say Cole Avery? Seems you've been playing a dangerous game using both names to throw us off your trail." "Someone planted that in my barn!" Colt's hands clenched into fists. "Can't you see what's happening? Someone is framing me." "Or you're finally caught," Pritchard gestured to his deputies. "Take him." As the deputies moved forward, Colt's hand went to his gun. Eleanor saw it happening as if in slow motion, saw Colt's fingers wrap around the grip, saw Pritchard's eyes narrow, saw the crowd gasp and scatter. "Don't," Eleanor said sharply, grabbing Colt's arm. "Don't give them a reason to shoot you." Colt looked at her, conflict raging in his eyes. Then, slowly, he removed his hand from his gun and raised both hands in surrender. The deputies grabbed him roughly, and Eleanor saw them twist Colt's arms behind his back, hard enough to make him grunt in pain. "You're making a mistake," Colt said to Pritchard. "The real thief is still out there, and while you're wasting time with me, he's getting away. The real thief is in my custody." Pritchard turned to Eleanor, and there might have been pity in his eyes. "Mrs. Avery, for your own protection, I suggest you distance yourself from this man. File for an annulment, cooperate with Mr. Hartford's lawsuit, and maybe you can salvage something from this disaster." "Go to hell," Eleanor said clearly. Pritchard's expression hardened. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." He mounted his horse, his deputies dragging Colt along behind. "Your husband's trial will be in 2 weeks. I suggest you prepare yourself for the verdict." As they led Colt away, he looked back at Eleanor one last time. "I didn't do this," he called out. "Eleanor, you have to believe me." "I do," she called back, not caring who heard. "I believe you." But as the crowd murmured and pointed and whispered, as she saw the judgment and disgust in their faces, Eleanor wondered if belief would be enough. Because the evidence against Colt was damning, the town had turned against them both. And in 2 weeks, the man she loved might hang for crimes he didn't commit. And Eleanor had no idea how to stop it. The broken window became a symbol of Eleanor's new reality, shattered, exposed, impossible to ignore. She spent the morning sweeping up glass while neighbors crossed the street to avoid passing her house, while children whispered and pointed, while the respectable women of Dakota Junction clutched their skirts a little tighter, as if Eleanor's disgrace might be contagious. She could have boarded up the window, hidden the ugly words painted on her wall. Instead, she left them visible, a defiant reminder that she wasn't ashamed of loving Colt Avery, no matter what the town thought. By afternoon, Thomas Hartford appeared at her door, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling concern. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about your situation," he began without preamble, "and I'm prepared to make you an offer." "I don't want anything from you." "Hear me out." Thomas stepped inside without invitation, his eyes taking in the damage, the broken glass she'd piled in a corner, the paint still wet on the wall. "This is only going to get worse. Avery's trial will be a spectacle. They'll drag your name through the mud alongside his. By the time it's over, you won't be able to show your face in decent society." "Then I'll find indecent society." Eleanor crossed her arms. "What's your offer, Thomas? Because I know you didn't come here out of the goodness of your heart." Thomas's mask of concern slipped, revealing the calculating man beneath. "I'll drop the lawsuit and provide you with a modest settlement, enough to pay your debts and start fresh somewhere else. In exchange, you testify against Avery at his trial." Eleanor's stomach turned. "Testify against him? What could I possibly say?" "The truth. That he was evasive about his past, that he had unexplained absences, that the saddlebag found in your barn could have been his. You don't have to lie. Just present the facts in a way that supports the prosecution's case." Thomas moved closer, his voice dropping to something almost kind. "Eleanor, this man has destroyed your life. Why protect him?" "Because I love him," Eleanor said simply, "and because he's innocent." "Love." Thomas spat the word like a curse. "Love is what foolish girls feel for handsome strangers. You're a grown woman, Eleanor. Act like one. Take my offer and save yourself before it's too late. Get out. You're making a mistake. I said get out." Eleanor's voice rose to a shout. "I would rather lose everything than betray the man I love. So take your offer and your lawsuit and your false concern and get the hell out of my house." Thomas's expression hardened into something ugly. "Fine. But when Avery hangs and you're left with nothing, don't come begging to me for help. You've made your choice, Eleanor. Now you'll live with the consequences." After he left, Eleanor sank onto her settee and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of despair. 5 minutes to feel the weight of her impossible situation, to acknowledge the fear that Thomas was right, that she was destroying herself for a man who might be guilty after all. Then she dried her eyes, straightened her spine, and got to work. If no one else would fight for Colt's innocence, then she would have to do it herself. Eleanor's first stop was the jail, where she found Marshal Pritchard sitting at his desk, filling out paperwork with methodical precision. "I want to see my husband," she announced. Pritchard looked up, something like sympathy in his weathered face. "Mrs. Avery, I don't think that's a good idea." "I don't care what you think. I have a legal right to see him." 5 minutes, Pritchard said finally, standing and retrieving a ring of keys. "And I'll be right outside the cell." Colt was in the last cell, sitting on a narrow cot with his head in his hands. When he heard footsteps, he looked up, and Eleanor's heart broke at the exhaustion and defeat in his eyes. "Eleanor," he breathed, "you shouldn't be here." "Where else would I be?" She gripped the bars separating them, wishing she could touch him. "How are you holding up?" "Been better." Colt moved to the bars, covering her hands with his. "Eleanor, listen to me. You need to distance yourself from this. File for an annulment, cooperate with Hartford, Save yourself while you still can. I'm not going to do that. Damn it, Eleanor. I'm not giving up on you, Colt, so stop asking me to. Eleanor squeezed his hands tightly. Now tell me everything you know about this saddlebag they found. Have you ever seen it before? Colt shook his head. Never. Someone planted it in your barn, probably the same night they painted that message on your wall. They're trying to make sure I hang. Who would do that? Who benefits from you being convicted? The real thief, obviously. As long as everyone thinks I'm Cole Avery, the real Cole Avery can keep operating. Colt's jaw tightened. But I've been thinking about it, and there's something that doesn't add up. The real thief has been active for months, hitting ranches and banks all over this territory. Why suddenly start framing someone? Why take that risk? Eleanor's mind raced. Unless you being here threatened him somehow. Unless there's a reason he needs you specifically to take the fall. Time's up, Pritchard called from the doorway. Wait, just one more minute. Eleanor started, but the marshal was already moving toward them. Rules are rules, Mrs. Avery. Come back tomorrow if you want. Colt caught Eleanor's hand through the bars. Be careful. Whoever's behind this, they're dangerous. They've already destroyed your window and your reputation. I don't want them hurting you. I can take care of myself, Eleanor said, though her voice shook slightly. I know you can, but let me worry about you anyway. Colt pulled her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. I love you, Eleanor Price Avery. No matter what happens, remember that. Nothing's going to happen, Eleanor said fiercely. I'm going to prove your innocence, and then we're going to have that life we talked about, the fresh start, the new beginning. All of it. But as Pritchard escorted her out of the jail, Eleanor felt the weight of that promise. She had 2 weeks to save Colt's life, and she had no idea where to start. The answer came from an unexpected source that evening. Eleanor was attempting to repair her broken window with boards and nails when she heard a horse approach. She looked up to find a stranger dismounting, a young man, maybe 25, with nervous eyes and a guilty expression. Mrs. Avery? He asked hesitantly. Yes? My name's Ben Hutchins. I worked at the Double R Ranch with Colt. Ben twisted his hat in his hands. I heard what happened, and I had to come. Ma'am, Colt Avery is a good man, one of the best I've ever known, and I can prove he wasn't anywhere near Deadwood when that bank was robbed. Eleanor's heart leaped. How? Because he was with me and 6 other hands, helping move cattle to the northern pasture. We were gone for 3 days, and Deadwood's a 2-day ride from the ranch. There's no way he could have been in both places. Ben pulled a worn notebook from his pocket. I keep records of every job, every hand who works it, every day we're out. It's all here in writing. Eleanor took the notebook with shaking hands, flipping through pages of meticulous entries. There it was. Colt's name listed alongside 6 others, dated exactly when the Deadwood robbery occurred. Why didn't you come forward before? Eleanor asked. Ben's face reddened. I was scared, ma'am. Marshal Pritchard came to the ranch asking questions, and the boss told us all to keep our mouths shut, said he didn't want trouble with the law. But then I heard they found evidence in your barn, and I knew someone was setting Colt up. I couldn't stay silent anymore. This could save his life, Eleanor breathed. Will you testify? Will you tell the court what you told me? Yes, ma'am. That's why I'm here. Ben straightened his shoulders. Colt risked his job to help me when I first came to the Double R, taught me everything I know about horses and cattle. I owe him. Eleanor wanted to hug this awkward, brave young man, but settled for shaking his hand firmly. Thank you, Mr. Hutchins. Thank you so much. There's one more thing you should know, Ben said hesitantly. About a month ago, a man came through the Double R looking for work. Said his name was Cole Avery. We all thought it was funny, him having almost the same name as Colt. But the boss didn't hire him, said something about the man gave him a bad feeling. This Cole, he was angry when he left. Real angry. Eleanor's pulse quickened. What did he look like? Similar to Colt, I guess. Same height, same build, but meaner looking, if that makes sense. Had a scar too, but his was on his right eyebrow, not his left. Ben frowned. You think he's the one framing Colt? I think it's a very good possibility. Eleanor's mind was racing now, pieces clicking into place. This Cole Avery shows up at the ranch, gets turned away, and then suddenly cattle start getting stolen and someone matching Colt's description is blamed. It's not a coincidence. What are you going to do? First, I'm taking you to Marshal Pritchard. He needs to hear your testimony and see your records. Eleanor grabbed her shawl. Then I'm going to find this real Cole Avery before anyone else gets hurt. Pritchard listened to Ben's testimony with a skeptical expression that gradually shifted to grudging interest. He examined the notebook, cross-referenced the dates, and finally leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. This does create reasonable doubt, he admitted. If Avery was where Hutchins says he was, he couldn't have robbed the Deadwood Bank. So you'll release him? Eleanor asked hopefully. Not yet. This proves he didn't commit one crime, but there are still others he's accused of. And there's still the matter of that saddlebag found in your barn. Pritchard tapped his fingers on his desk. But I'll look into this Cole Avery angle. If there really is someone using a similar name to commit crimes, I need to find him. I think I know where to start looking, Eleanor said. Thomas Hartford. Pritchard's eyebrows rose. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Avery. Think about it. Thomas shows up in town the day after Colt and I get married. He's furious that I chose someone else, threatens to sue me, and suddenly evidence starts appearing that makes Colt look guilty. Evidence that would dissolve our marriage and force me back into Thomas's arms. Eleanor leaned forward. What if Thomas is working with this real Cole Avery? Or what if Thomas is Cole Avery? Hartford's a clerk from St. Louis. He has references, employment records. That could be faked, Eleanor interrupted. Have you actually verified any of it? Pritchard was silent for a moment. I'll look into it, he said finally. But Mrs. Avery, you need to be careful. If Hartford is involved in this, confronting him could be dangerous. More dangerous than doing nothing while my husband faces the gallows. Eleanor stood. I'm going to find the truth, Marshal, with or without your help. Eleanor didn't go home that night. Instead, she went to the one place she thought might hold answers, the hotel where Thomas Hartford was staying. The desk clerk was a young man Eleanor had made a shirt for last year, and he owed her a favor. It took some convincing and a promise of a new vest, but eventually he let her into Thomas's room while Thomas was at supper. Eleanor's hand shook as she rifled through Thomas's belongings, not entirely sure what she was looking for. She found the usual things, clothes, toiletries, a Bible that looked like it had never been opened. Then, in the bottom of Thomas's trunk, hidden under a false panel, she found it. A second saddlebag, identical to the one found in her barn. And inside it, a collection of items that made Eleanor's blood run cold, banknotes from 3 different banks, jewelry that looked like it had been stolen, and a leather-bound journal filled with meticulous notes about robberies, about times and places, and amounts stolen. But it was the last page that made Eleanor's hands tremble. A list of names, each one crossed out except for 2. Colt Avery and Eleanor Price. Below the names, in Thomas's neat handwriting, final phase, frame Avery, force Eleanor to choose. If she chooses him, both hang. If she chooses me, problem solved. Eleanor's heart hammered as she realized the scope of Thomas's plan. He wasn't just a scorned suitor seeking revenge. He was the real Cole Avery, the cattle thief and bank robber who'd been terrorizing the territory for months. And he'd targeted Colt specifically because Colt's similar name and prison record made him the perfect scapegoat. She needed to get this evidence to Marshal Pritchard immediately. Eleanor was carefully replacing the false bottom of the trunk when she heard the door open behind her. Looking for something, Eleanor? Thomas's voice was cold, and when Eleanor turned, she saw he was holding a gun pointed directly at her heart. I found what I needed, Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. The Marshal will be very interested in your collection. The Marshal won't see anything. Thomas closed the door behind him, locking it with his free hand. Because you're not leaving this room. People know I'm here. The desk clerk will say he never saw you. I paid him well to forget. Thomas moved closer, and Eleanor backed up until she hit the wall. You should have taken my offer, Eleanor. I was willing to be generous, to give you a way out. But you chose that criminal over security, over me. That was your mistake. The only mistake I made was ever writing to you in the first place." Eleanor's mind raced, searching for an escape. "You're not a clerk from St. Louis, are you? You're Cole Avery, the real Cole Avery." Thomas smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. "Very clever. Yes, I'm Cole Avery. Or I was, until I decided that name had become too dangerous. When I heard about a man named Colt Avery working up north, it seemed like Providence. Same name, same build, already had a criminal record. All I had to do was commit a few crimes near where he'd been, and everyone would assume he was their man. But why target me? Why come all the way to Dakota Junction? Because I needed a reason to be here, a legitimate reason that wouldn't raise suspicion. Your advertisement for a mail-order husband was perfect. William Hartford was a real person, a clerk I knew in St. Louis who died of influenza last winter. I took his identity, his papers, his letters of reference. No one questioned it." Thomas's expression hardened. "I came here planning to marry you, establish myself as a respectable citizen, and use Dakota Junction as a base for my operations. But then you married Avery instead, and I had to adjust my plans. You framed him. I simply helped the evidence point to the obvious conclusion. Colt Avery was already a criminal. Making him look like Cole Avery wasn't difficult." Thomas gestured with his gun toward the bed. "Sit down. We're going to wait here until after midnight, and then we're going to take a little trip." "I'm not going anywhere with you." "You don't have a choice." Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. "Sit. Down." Eleanor sat, her mind working frantically. She needed to stall, needed to find a way to escape or signal for help. "If you kill me, everyone will know you did it. You'll never get away with it." "Who said anything about killing you? Though I suppose that depends on how cooperative you are." Thomas pulled a length of rope from his coat pocket. "Hold out your hands." "No." Thomas moved with surprising speed, grabbing Eleanor's wrists and forcing them together. She fought, kicking and struggling, but he was stronger and had the advantage of the gun pressed against her ribs. "Stop fighting, or I'll shoot you right here and deal with the consequences," Thomas hissed. Eleanor went still, and Thomas quickly bound her wrists. Then he gagged her with a handkerchief and pushed her down onto the bed. "Much better." Thomas checked his pocket watch. 4 hours until midnight. Try to get comfortable, Eleanor. We have a long night ahead of us." Eleanor's mind raced as she lay there, bound and helpless. No one knew where she was. Ben Hutchins had left town, and Marshall Pritchard wasn't taking her suspicions seriously. By the time anyone realized she was missing, Thomas could have taken her anywhere, done anything. But then Eleanor remembered something. The broken window at her house, still unrepaired, the pile of glass in the corner, the ugly words on the wall that she'd left visible as an act of defiance. Colt would know something was wrong when she didn't visit him tomorrow. He would raise alarm, would push Pritchard to investigate. And when they came looking for her, they'd search Thomas's room. If she could just leave them something to find, some sign that she'd been here. Eleanor's eyes fell on the journal still sitting on top of the trunk. If she could somehow knock it to the floor, make it visible, it might be enough. She waited until Thomas was distracted, checking the window to make sure the street was clear. Then she rolled, deliberately falling off the bed with a heavy thud that sent her crashing into the trunk. "What the hell?" Thomas spun around and Eleanor saw his expression change as the journal tumbled from the trunk, pages scattering across the floor. For a moment they both stared at the evidence now spread across the room, the meticulous notes, the damning confessions, all the proof needed to hang Cole Avery for his crimes. Then Thomas lunged for the papers, and Eleanor threw herself forward, kicking them further away even as Thomas grabbed her ankle and dragged her back. "You stupid bitch!" Thomas raised his hand to strike her, and Eleanor braced herself for the blow. It never came. The door exploded inward with a crash, and suddenly the room was full of people. Marshall Pritchard, 2 deputies, and behind them, impossibly, Colt Avery. Thomas grabbed for his gun, but Colt was faster, crossing the room in 3 strides and slamming into Thomas with enough force to send them both crashing into the wall. The gun went flying, and Colt's fist connected with Thomas's jaw with a satisfying crack. "That's for threatening my wife," Colt growled, hauling Thomas up only to hit him again. "And that's for putting your hands on her." "Avery, that's enough." Pritchard pulled Colt back while his deputies secured Thomas, who was dazed and bleeding from a split lip. Colt immediately turned to Eleanor, gently removing her gag and untying her wrists. Are you all right? Did he hurt you? I'm fine, Eleanor managed, though her voice shook. How did you find me? Ben Hutchins came back. Said he was worried about you going after Hartford alone, so he went to the jail and convinced Pritchard to release me temporarily. Colt pulled Eleanor into his arms, holding her like he'd never let go. When we got to your house and you weren't there, we started searching. The desk clerk finally admitted Hartford had paid him to forget seeing you. Pritchard was examining the scattered papers, his expression growing darker by the moment. Well, well, looks like Mrs. Avery was right about you, Hartford. Or should I say Avery? Cole Avery? Thomas spat blood onto the floor. You can't prove anything. This journal says otherwise. You've documented every crime you committed for the past 6 months. Pritchard held up a page covered in Thomas's handwriting. You're going to hang for this, Hartford, not Colt Avery. You. As the deputies dragged Thomas away, still protesting his innocence, Eleanor sagged against Colt, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her shaking. It's over, Colt murmured into her hair. It's finally over. Is it? Eleanor pulled back to look at him. Are you free? Really free? Pritchard cleared his throat. Based on this evidence and Mr. Hutchins' testimony, all charges against Colt Avery are dropped. You're a free man, Mr. Avery, and I apologize for the trouble. Apology accepted, Colt said, though his tone suggested it wasn't quite forgiven. Can we go home now? After you give your official statements tomorrow? Yes. Pritchard tipped his hat. Mrs. Avery, that was brave work tonight. Foolish, but brave. After the marshal left, Colt and Eleanor stood in the destroyed hotel room, holding each other and trying to believe it was real. I thought I'd lost you, Colt said quietly. When Pritchard told me you'd confronted Hartford alone, I thought... His voice broke. Eleanor, don't ever scare me like that again. I had to. You were going to hang, and no one else was going to save you. Eleanor cupped his face in her hands. I told you I wouldn't give up on you. I meant it. I know you did, and I love you for it, even if it did take 10 years off my life. Colt kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. Let's go home. Home. The word had never sounded so sweet. The next morning, Dakota Junction woke to news that spread faster than prairie fire. Thomas Hartford was the real Cole Avery, the notorious cattle thief who'd terrorized 3 territories. Colt Avery, the man they'd all condemned, was innocent. And Eleanor Price Avery, the woman they'd shunned and painted obscenities about, was a hero who'd risked her life to uncover the truth. The town's shame was palpable. Mrs. Calloway appeared on Eleanor's porch before breakfast, wringing her hands. My dear, I owe you the most profound apology. We all do. The way we treated you, the things we said, the things you painted on my wall. Eleanor gestured to the crude words still visible beside her broken window. Mrs. Calloway had the grace to look mortified. I didn't personally, but I should have stopped it. Should have defended you. She pressed a basket into Eleanor's hands. Please, let me make amends. Let us all make amends. By noon, Eleanor's house was full of offerings, food, fabric, money to repair her window, and apologies that ranged from sincere to self-serving. Eleanor accepted them with cool grace, making it clear that while she forgave, she wouldn't forget. Mr. Peterson offered to extend her credit indefinitely, and Mrs. Henderson commissioned 3 more dresses, paying in advance. Sally came by with tears in her eyes, apologizing for her mother's behavior and begging Eleanor to still be her friend. Of course, Eleanor said, hugging the younger woman. You were one of the few who never doubted me. The most surprising visitor came late in the afternoon. Marshal Pritchard, accompanied by a well-dressed man who introduced himself as Judge Morrison. Mrs. Avery, Mr. Avery, the judge said formally. I've reviewed the evidence in both your case and Mr. Hartford's lawsuit. I'm here to inform you that all charges and claims against you are dismissed. Furthermore, as Hartford was operating under a false identity when he filed suit, the entire proceeding is null and void. Eleanor felt Colt's arm tighten around her waist. So we're free. Completely free. Completely free, Judge Morrison confirmed. In fact, Given the exceptional circumstances and the hardship you've endured, the territorial government is prepared to offer compensation for your troubles. $500, to be paid immediately. $500. It was more money than Eleanor had seen in 3 years, enough to pay off her debts, repair her house, and still have something left over. We accept, Colt said before Eleanor could speak. With gratitude. After the judge left, Eleanor and Colt stood in their small parlor, still damaged, still bearing the scars of the past week, but theirs, and looked at each other. $500, Eleanor breathed. We could do anything, go anywhere. Where do you want to go? Colt asked. Eleanor looked around at the house she'd fought so hard to keep, at the dress shop that represented her independence, at the town visible through her broken window. A week ago, she would have said anywhere but here. But now, I want to stay, she said slowly. I want to rebuild, to make this shop into something worth having, to show this town that I'm not someone they can break. She looked up at Colt. But only if you stay with me. Really stay, not as part of a charade or because you're trapped. I want you to choose to be here. Colt was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor felt her heart hammer with fear that she'd asked too much, assumed too much. Then he smiled, that crooked smile that had first caught her attention on the train platform, what felt like a lifetime ago. Eleanor Price Avery, I stepped off that train planning to be here for a day. Then it was a week. Then it was however long it took to clear my name. But the truth is, from the moment you kissed me at that altar, I was never really leaving. Colt pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. You're stuck with me, for better or worse, till death do us part. All of it. Those are wedding vows, Eleanor said, smiling through sudden tears. They are. And this time I mean every word. Colt kissed her softly. I love you, Eleanor. I choose you. I choose this life, this town, this future. All of it. Even the broken window? Especially the broken window. It's part of our story now. They stood there, holding each other in the golden afternoon light, two people who'd married by mistake and found something real in the chaos. Outside, Dakota Junction continued its daily rhythm, but something had shifted. The struggling seamstress and the ex-convict cowboy had become the couple who'd exposed a criminal and proved that love and courage could triumph over fear and prejudice. It would take time to rebuild everything that had been broken. Eleanor's reputation, her business, the trust between them and their community. But they had time now. They had each other. They had hope. And they had a future that stretched out before them like the endless Dakota prairie. 3 months later, on a cold January morning, Eleanor stood in front of her shop and admired her handiwork. The new sign above the door read, Avery and Avery, fine dresses and custom leatherwork, in elegant gold lettering. Inside, her sewing table sat beside Colt's workbench, where he crafted custom saddles and tack for ranchers throughout the territory. They'd used the compensation money wisely, paying debts, repairing the house, and investing in quality materials for both their trades. Eleanor's designs were gaining recognition beyond Dakota Junction, and Colt's reputation for honest work had spread faster than any gossip ever had. The broken window had been replaced with beautiful stained glass, commissioned from an artist in Denver. But Eleanor had kept the board with the painted words, storing it in the barn as a reminder of how far they'd come. Admiring your work? Colt emerged from the shop, wiping his hands on a rag. Our work, Eleanor corrected, leaning into him as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. I was just thinking about that first day, when you stepped off the train and turned my whole life upside down. Best mistake I ever made, Colt murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. It wasn't a mistake, Eleanor said, turning in his arms to face him. It was fate. It was meant to be. Call it whatever you want, but we were always supposed to find each other. Even if it took a wrong ticket and a confused reverend and a criminal trying to frame me for his crimes. Especially then. Eleanor kissed him, sweet and lingering. The best stories always start with a mistake. A train whistle echoed across the prairie, and they both turned to watch the afternoon express pull into the station. Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been 3 months ago, standing on that platform hoping a stranger would save her from her loneliness and debt. She'd gotten so much more than she'd bargained for, not a savior, but a partner. Not security, but love. Not an escape from her problems, but the courage to face them. Colt took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Avery?" "I'm already home," Eleanor said, squeezing his hand. "Wherever you are, that's home." They walked back to their house as the winter sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Two people who'd married by accident and stayed by choice, who'd turned a mistake into a miracle, who'd proven that sometimes the wrong train brings you to exactly the right destination. Behind them, the new sign swayed gently in the Dakota wind, a symbol of everything they'd built together and everything they'd yet to become. The struggling seamstress had found her strength, the ex-convict had found redemption, and together they'd found something neither of them had been looking for, but both desperately needed. They'd found home, and as Eleanor looked up at Colt, saw the love and promise in his blue eyes, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because that's what partners did. That's what love meant. The wrong ticket had led her to the right stranger, and the stranger had become her husband, and the husband had become her heart. Some mistakes, Eleanor thought as they stepped into their warm house and closed the door against the winter cold, are really blessings in disguise. This one certainly was.